Honourable members, please be seated.
Introduction of visitors, introduction of guests, ministerial statements, member statements.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Castle Downs.
Mr. Speaker, at the 11th hour, organizations who are working on completing applications for grants for community initiative projects suddenly realized the money they were applying for had been moved. Not only is it disappointing that these organizations who provide art, serve seniors, and support communities will not be able to contribute in the same way. They went through a thoughtful and time-consuming process that ended up for nothing. Heather Inglis, artistic producer of Workshop West Playwright, said, "We have been working on the grant on and off since January, only to discover that the funding wasn't available. This is shameful and is only one of the many attacks the UCP has taken on the arts industry. They have cut $2.4 million from the Foundation of the Arts since forming government. Furthermore, they recently and quietly changed funding so artists cannot access many different grants for the summer. While we called on them to do the opposite, to make funding more flexible and accessible, just like municipalities have, the government has taken steps to take funding away. Vern Thiessen, an award-winning playwright, has described this as a blindside. And then when we made the call to ensure artists were represented in Alberta's economic recovery, the Premier's office laughed at the idea. They laughed at the value the arts brings to our province. Over 60,000 are employed in the arts and generate over $5 billion annually to our economy. The UCP's words and lack of support are insulting. There are many things I could say about this insult, but I will quote Andrew Fung, an actor from Calgary and recent winner of a Canadian Screen Award, yesterday in fact, for his role in Kim's Convenience. Congrats, Andrew. I'm an actor, comedian, writer, and MC. I am an artist and proud Calgarian. I'm also a business owner with a degree in economics from @U Calgary. Artists have value. Thank you @Rachel Notley and @Alberta NDP for recognizing our worth. Mr. Speaker, sure, the government can laugh at the comedy that artists like Andrew contribute, but do not laugh at the value that they contribute to our province.
The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This House stands as part of a centuries-old democratic tradition where legislators assemble to effect the will of the public and where we ensure the proper responsible function of government. The democratic traditions of this House predate the very existence of democracy in some other nations. The operation of our democracy rests on every member of this House conducting themselves in an honourable way. And, Mr. Speaker, while I'm not calling into question the honour of any in particular member, I am very concerned about the conduct of the official opposition. Yesterday, due to the unprecedented nature of the pandemic, we held a special debate on COVID-19, allowing members to question the Premier and the ministers. This debate was organized and agreed upon by House leaders from the government and opposition sides. The government asked the opposition which ministers they wished to question, and those ministers were made available. The government even accepted an amendment from the opposition specifying the 4 ministers the NDP wanted present for questions: health, finance, labour, and education. Then, last night, the opposition told the public and the media that ministers they didn't request to be present were avoiding the House and not doing their jobs. Now, I will make an exception.
Everyone in the chamber will know that there's a long-standing tradition of member statements being able to be delivered uninterrupted, even if you may or may not be cheering on your own team. The Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika can continue.
Thank my colleagues. Now, I will not make an accusation against any individual member, but this was deceptive, it was dishonest, and it was dishonourable. The conduct was unacceptable for any member of this House. Did the opposition House Leader not review the amendments before she submitted them? Did she not inform her caucus colleagues of what the amendments meant before the opposition, by way of Twitter, took to social media? Were they acting in bad faith the entire time? Unfortunately, in recent months, these kinds of uncivil and unfounded attacks have become increasingly commonplace. I should also point out that the opposition was initially concerned about too many ministers being present in the chamber. I guess they can't seem to make up their minds. In any case, Mr. Speaker, next week they'll be given the opportunity to question any number of ministers on the subject of COVID-19. We are finished playing these childish games.
The Honourable Member for Brooks, Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week is National Paramedic Service Week. In many situations, timely access to critical care is the dividing line between life and death, and over 9,000 heroic men and women answer this call in Alberta. In southern Alberta, the spotlight has been most recently and rightfully been on air ambulance services in remote and rural areas. This crucial service ensures that the most critically ill patients can get the care that they need as quickly as possible to the highest standard. I have stood up in this House on several occasions to speak about rural health services and consider it a great privilege to bring attention to a topic that is of great importance to me and also the constituents of Brooks Medicine Hat. Halo Air Ambulance proudly serves southern Alberta in a timely manner, taking care to efficiently and without hesitation respond to people in need. Due to the pandemic, this service, which operates almost entirely on donations, has found itself in jeopardy. One of my first actions after being elected was to sit down with our Minister of Health and advocate for Halo. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, AHS began its review of the helicopter emergency medical services in order to examine how best to ensure remote and rural Albertans have access to high-quality and equitable emergency care. I was pleased to hear that once government became aware of the financial hardship of Halo, our Health Minister expedited the HEMS review to provide government recommendations. Mr. Speaker, my constituents need assurance that should they run into hardship, help will be there. Time and time again, small local businesses and citizens have fundraised and given their time and talent to support Halo, and they are making their voices heard right now. They're donating and working diligently when many would have given up, even in the midst of multiple global crises. My constituents deserve timely access to air ambulance services, Mr. Speaker, just like every other taxpayer in this province. This has been a priority for me in the past and will continue to be a priority for me in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, notwithstanding the completely untrue statements from the member from Cardston-Staseka, what is true is that this government needs to do more. Because, Mr. Speaker, May is ending, which means Asian Heritage Month is coming to a close. Now, rather than spending this month with good friends, families, and our communities, reflecting on the contributions that Asian Canadians have made and continue to make, communities have had to resort to going online to advocate on a different topic. Diversity has always been one of Alberta's greatest strengths, and it's this government's duty to ensure that all Albertans have safety, respect, and dignity, which is clearly outlined as something that every Albertan deserves. Now, over the last 2 centuries, immigrants from all over Asia have continued to make contributions to the growth and prosperity in our country. This month was founded to help celebrate the advocacy and the history of Asian Canadians and their contributions to the prosperity of Canada. However, instead, this month has seen Asian Canadians targeted, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. Just yesterday, we saw graffiti placed on the Chinese consulate right here in Calgary. And this government has been vocally criticized by that very consulate for stroking comments that have stoked xenophobia directly across this province. Yesterday morning's racist slurs were painted on the brick walls of their building, and this is the second such attack on the Chinese consulate. This pandemic has led to a lot of political debate and strong opinions. However, this should not be a cover for targeting Asians. This government has a duty to get involved and stand in solidarity with our Asian community. This has led to racism and xenophobia that has been undocumented. This government's comments have led to things like shouts against strangers in parking lots, service refusals, and other discrimination. Asian Heritage Month was supposed to remind us that it's as important as ever to honour Asians' contributions to our province as doctors, teachers, and so much more. Now is not the time for empty platitudes. Now is the time for this government to speak out. The community has done their part in raising awareness and advocating. Now it's this government's turn. I would like to use this moment to directly call on the Premier of this province to condemn the xenophobic attack on the Chinese consulate. This government must act and condemn xenophobia.
The Honourable Member for Central, Peace Notley.
This year has been particularly hard for Albertans with the perfect storm of a pandemic and an oil price crash. The agriculture sector of our economy has been hit by even more factors out of their control. Wet weather the last few autumns has forced farmers to leave crops in the field over the winter, causing in some instances total crop loss from winter damage and wildlife damage. Sadly, Alberta beekeepers have even suffered more. The last couple summers they have been cold and wet in some parts of Alberta, and the smoke from other parts drastically reduced honey production. Low honey prices have also hit the industry. In addition, this past winter has resulted in higher than normal winter loss of hives, some beekeepers losing as much as 90% of their hives. Then to top it all off, the cancellation of flights due to COVID has drastically reduced the supply of replacement bee packages that would normally replace the winter lost hives. Last year, there was over 300,000 hives across Alberta. The loss this year could be about 60,000 hives that would put our numbers back a decade. The Alberta Bee Commission that represents Alberta beekeepers voted unanimously to allow bee packages to come in from Northern California to help alleviate these huge losses. Unfortunately, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency continues to block this supply of bee packages, even though they allow queen bees and their attendant bees to be imported from the same location. This is a lifeline that would make an enormous difference to the viability of many Alberta businesses. Last week, I received a call about a traveller who had stopped in my hometown of Valley View and had a bee swarm enter his vehicle through the sunroof while he was stopped. I was able to help out and remove the bee so he could resume his travel. Swarming is a natural process, though beekeepers try to prevent it, as it is a loss to their business, and swarms that are not caught and brought into hives rarely survive long. Swarms tend not to be aggressive, but you still need to be careful. The town of Flair in Central Peace constituency, the one I represent, is considered the honey capital of Canada. The bee industry is so important to our Alberta economy, from the pollination of the $25 billion hybrid canola seed production and other crops, fruits, berries, and gardens, to honey and honey-based products. Bees and their keepers are an essential part of Alberta life that we as their elected representatives must stand up for.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood.
I contemplated taking my own life on many occasions, chiefly because I felt so unworthy. I was told that I was loved unconditionally by those around me and by God, but then heard constant messages about how much I needed to change to be truly welcomed into my faith community. Those are just some of the words from Lauren, who shared with me her painful experiences with conversion therapy. Her story might just be one story, but it's the story of many. And since hearing her story last year, I've heard from so many other survivors who've endured this torturous practice. It's clear that conversion therapy is wrong and it is abusive. Yet there are people out there who deny this fact, those who would want to expose others to abuse that leads to depression, anxiety, self-hatred, and thoughts of suicide. Fortunately, those people are in the minority. And we've seen more and more municipalities step up and pass motions that would end this harmful practice in their cities and towns, including the city of Calgary, which passed a bylaw this week. I'm so proud of the leadership in these communities and the voices of so many individuals, not just elected officials, who've stepped up to say that unequivocally conversion therapy is not welcome here. And thanks to their hard work, 2/3 of Albertans now live in a municipality with a ban in place or underway. But what about that remaining 1/3? What about the powers that fall under provincial responsibility? It's clear that Albertans want conversion therapy banned, but we need more. We need all levels of government to take this issue seriously and to end the abuse being inflicted on members of the LGBTQ2S+ community. What governments do and the signals that they send matter. This is why it was so disheartening when the UCP ended our conversion therapy working group, which had been tasked with providing recommendations on ways to effectively ban the practice here in Alberta. We see other provincial governments acting, and the federal government is also taking action. Yet, silence from this Premier. I'm moved by Lauren's story and the story that so many others have bravely shared. But I can't help thinking about the stories that we won't hear because those folks aren't here to share them. This isn't about partisanship. This is about real people, which means we need real leadership. What are you waiting for, Mr. Premier?
The Honourable Member for Vermilion Lloydminster Wainwright.
Mr. Speaker, with the tragic situation in Fort McMurray fresh in our minds and the winter melt well underway, there is much talk about flooding in Alberta. Water mitigation and water issues in particular are important issues, nowhere more than in rural Alberta and my constituency of Vermilion Lloydminster Wainwright. The water concern currently plaguing my constituency is the flooding in the town of Paradise Valley. Paradise Valley is known for its rich agricultural history, ranching, and friendly people. But to the residents of the area, it is also known as a place that has the potential for flooding, specifically the Paradise Valley Lagoon, which sits on the edge of Bryker Lake. I personally visited the site last summer as the lagoon was almost overflowing. The town council raised the berm 9 feet and flooding was prevented. However, the town of Paradise Valley and surrounding areas live with the specter of flooding year in and year out. This year, even the new higher berm is now in jeopardy of failing, and an emergency trench had to be dug in order to divert the water to prevent property damage. This is not a new issue. In 1975, an engineer employed by the Alberta government surveyed the area and made a recommendation to relocate the lagoon. However, this solution was deemed at the time as being impractical. Mr. Speaker, the exact cause of the flooding is being investigated at the moment. This survey, using modern technology and expertise, will identify the source and the proposed and a proposal to correct the course of action in order to alleviate issues in the future. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank both the Ministry of Environment and Parks as well as the Ministry of Transportation for the attention they have given this issue. This once again shows that the concerns of rural Alberta do not go unnoticed by this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last few months have been incredibly hard for Albertans all across our beautiful province. Our routines have been disrupted more than any of us have seen at any part of our lives. Yet despite this disruption, Albertans have rallied together. To quote columnist David Staples, Albertans haven't just flattened the curve, we have steamrolled it and chucked it down a large hill. On May 14th, our government began our plan to relaunch Alberta, with retail stores, hair salons, of which I'm a regular customer, museums, art galleries, and more opening up in most areas of the province. While Calgary and Brooks saw the reopening plans pause until just this past weekend, the entire province is now able to reap the rewards of Albertans' hard work and commitment in battling COVID-19. Now, there was some concern that we would see a bump in COVID-19 cases as we reopen. Today, 2 weeks after the reopening of much of the province, that has not been the case. Cases have slowly but surely gone down. And I'm pleased to say hospitalizations have been cut in half since the peak of this crisis. Now, in my riding of Spruce Grove, Stony Plain, there are currently 0 active cases, and as a result, businesses and parks have reopened. Albertans have taken the advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, seriously. This is what let us open originally and what has prevented us from seeing a bump in cases. Over the next couple of weeks, Albertans will have to continue in this attitude as we wait for further stages of our relaunch strategy. As they always have, I believe Albertans will rally together and take care of each other, this time by keeping just a little extra distance between themselves. We have sacrificed too much to risk it all at this point. Thank you.
The honourable member for Fort Saskatchewan-Vegreville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to address the class of 2020. COVID-19 has impacted your high school experience. Our thoughts and prayers have been with you as you've adapted to the teacher-led, home-based learning. I too have a daughter graduating this year, and our family has been experiencing all these changes along with you. Many of you did not know that high school as you knew it would end so abruptly, and you would not see your fellow students and teachers again. For every other grade in the K-12 system, there will be more time to build lasting memories in school with these friends. For you, our grade 12 graduates, this chapter is closed, and this is disappointing. Not only for you, but for your parents, teachers, support staff, and administrators. School trips, sports, plays, and even in some cases, the grad ceremonies have been canceled. Many schools are still weighing out options of just postponing final grad ceremonies. Other schools and organizations are finding new ways to celebrate grad during COVID, like a drive-in ceremony that St. Mary's in Vegreville had, which my daughter took part in. Students, I know this isn't the ending you were expecting, but I want you to all be encouraged. High school graduation marks the end of your K-12 journey and accomplishments, but it also marks the beginning of what lies ahead. You are our next wave of innovators, entrepreneurs, creators, and strategic thinkers. Your future is bright. To our graduating students, you have all come so far. Please do not allow COVID-19 to undervalue your achievements. I am truly excited for all of you and cannot wait to see what you achieve in the future. Congratulations to the class of 2020.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions. Notices of motions.
Honourable members, I see the Honourable Official Opposition House Leader has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On appropriate notice that was provided to your office and to the Office of the Government House Leader, I now rise to inform the House that I plan to rise in this Assembly later today at the end of the daily routine to request the opportunity to make a brief statement on why a media briefing on Bill 15 that took place this morning breached the rights of this Assembly and my rights as a member of this Assembly.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We are at oral question period, and the Leader of Her Majesty's Official Opposition has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This Premier has piled costs onto Albertans when they can least afford it and lectured them on living with less. He's forcing schools to fire staff, raise fees on parents, and cancel critical programs for vulnerable special needs students. He's forcing tuition hikes onto students who just lost their summer job, and he's still dragging his feet over paid sick leave for vulnerable Alberta workers. So tell me, why is it that everyone else has to live with less while this Premier's cash-strapped, spend-happy political party gets a giant taxpayer-funded bailout from Ottawa?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't even know how to respond. Well, the Leader of the Opposition stands up and throws out about a dozen falsehoods. Where do you even begin? This is the Leader of the Opposition who, when we offered to put up 11 ministers for a full-day report on COVID and open questions from the opposition, they came back and asked for 4 ministers specifically to do that. We adopted the NDP motion as an expression of our magnanimity and our accountability to the official opposition. Then the NDP attacked us for only allowing the 4 ministers, which were embedded in their motion, Mr. Speaker. I don't even know how to deal with an opposition that makes things up and twists the facts hour by hour.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that it was always clear we wanted to ask other ministers questions too, but that's not the issue. The wage subsidy is meant for businesses that have lost revenue due to the pandemic. The UCP's revenue dropped because it's not an election year, and that's a different reason. They are exploiting a loophole to get their hands on federal cash while thousands of Alberta businesses get left out in the cold. So will the Premier stop distracting and instead direct his party to give the money back and step up to make sure that the federal money can get to the struggling Alberta businesses it's meant for?
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have the motion that the NDP brought forward yesterday, which in a spirit of magnanimity the government accepted, striking out any other member of the Executive Council. We adopted the NDP's requested approach, then they attacked us for it. On the matter that she's now addressing, you know, Mr. Speaker, unlike the NDP, the UCP suspended partisan fundraising for weeks following the beginning of the pandemic out of respect for Albertans. But on March 17th, the day a public health emergency was declared, the NDP sent out a begging letter trying to monetize the pandemic. Shame on them.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Quote, this guy is an empty trust fund millionaire who has the political depth of a finger bowl, end quote. That's the Premier describing his new biggest donor, the Prime Minister. Quote, political parties should be funded by their supporters voluntarily, not by forcing all taxpayers to pay their bills. That's the Premier again. This is a question of government policy because Albertans are overwhelmed by this hypocrisy and they need their government to be consistent. Will the Premier take his own advice and pay back the money to Canada's overburdened taxpayers?
The Premier.
Imagine that crew talking about consistency. At 10 in the morning, they asked the government to limit us to 4 ministers for the COVID debate. Then at 5 in the afternoon, I don't know what happened in the intervening few hours. It must have been an entertaining time up at the Leader's office, Mr. Speaker. They attacked us for adopting their approach. Mr. Speaker, unlike the NDP, we, the UCP, are not trying to squeeze money out of supporters by monetizing the pandemic. Shame on them, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Leader of the Official Opposition has the call.
Again, Mr. Speaker, those facts are absolutely incorrect. Yesterday, in question period, the Premier let it slip that he intends to lift Alberta's public health emergency on June 15th. But when the media asked the Chief Medical Officer of Health about this decision, she said, quote, so I haven't had the opportunity to have that conversation, so I think that might be a question best addressed to the Premier in terms of that particular information, end quote. Why was this fundamentally serious public health decision made by the Premier without Dr. Hinshaw's knowledge?
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Public Health Act allows for an emergency to be declared for limited purposes. The stated purpose, the explicit purpose, was to allow for extraordinary measures to be taken to manage healthcare human resources at the height of the pandemic to ensure that we were not overwhelmed. That was now weeks ago. We have 1,000 acute care beds set aside for COVID patients, occupied by about 45 of those patients. We no longer require those extraordinary authorities, which were the entire premise of the invocation of a public health emergency in the middle of March.
The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, yesterday the BC government extended their state of emergency by another 2 weeks and said there is likely no end in sight. The Horgan government also noted, quote, the extension of the provincial state of emergency is based on recommendations from BC's health and emergency management officials. When other provinces are still working closely with their public health officials, why does the Premier of Alberta believe he can decide the end of a public health emergency without even the knowledge of Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we have not made a final decision, and of course, if there's a sudden spike in infections or hospitalizations that are unforeseen at this point, we'll have to correct course. That's the sort of environment in which we will be until there is a widespread access to a safe vaccine. Having said that, if current trends continue, there are none of the conditions that apply today which applied in mid-March, which required the invocation of a public health emergency. I know the NDP leader is taking orders from her taskmaster over at the AFL, who wants to shut down the entire Alberta economy indefinitely, but we won't let them do that.
Leader of the Opposition.
That was a very weird little rabbit hole, but nonetheless, there are many areas where Alberta's pandemic response has been excellent, Mr. Speaker. However, this government delayed their response in continuing care and failed entirely in meatpacking. Up to now, the Premier has refused to take responsibility for these mistakes and instead has hidden behind the Chief Medical Officer of Health. The Premier can't have it both ways. Premier, are you now prepared to accept responsibility for the delayed response in continuing care and the largest outbreak on the continent at Cargill?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, every jurisdiction on the face of the earth, at least in the Western world, I think this excludes some Asian countries that closed their borders from hotspots immediately, but that exception, every jurisdiction has sadly seen the novel coronavirus infect congregate seniors' living facilities. Thankfully, here in Alberta, we have had much less tragic experience in that respect than other jurisdictions like Quebec, Ontario, New York, and many others, thanks in part to the quick action of the government, our public health officials, and the staff at our continuing care facilities.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a few questions about how we're helping people through this recession. We need folks over there to spend more time helping ordinary people and less time finding underhanded loopholes for the UCP to help themselves to Justin Trudeau's money. Now, on this side, we have proposed serious policies like direct grants to small business and cutting business insurance costs. But yesterday, the Minister of Finance said no to all of this. But maybe now that his party is taking Ottawa's money while he does very little in his own province, and that looks pretty bad, I will ask again, will the Minister give at least some of the same support to small business that the UCP is giving to themselves?
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to reach out to small businesses. We are continuing to respond to small businesses. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we rolled out a series of deferrals, but on top of the deferrals was premium abatement for small and medium-sized businesses of their WCB premiums. Mr. Speaker, that is $350 million of relief. We've also rolled out, are participating in the commercial rent relief program, Mr. Speaker, and we are open to hear of additional need and we're prepared to roll out an additional program.
The member for Lethbridge West.
Recession, Mr. Speaker, the NDP caucus has been listening to Albertans struggling with skyrocketing car insurance. So far, the Premier's only response to these concerns has been to boast about the money he is saving on his own car insurance. I'm sensing a theme here, Mr. Speaker. Worry about yourself first, even if it means making Justin Trudeau the UCP's sugar daddy, but do nothing for working people. Yesterday, I asked the Minister of Finance if he would bring down people's car insurance during the pandemic. He said, yeah, probably not. Does the Minister consider the job now done that the Premier got his $200 back, or is he actually going to help people and bring down their car insurance?
The Honourable Minister of Finance and the President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, we're aware that premiums have been high in the automobile insurance sector. In fact, we have appointed a panel to look into the underlying causes for the high cost of insurance premiums. Mr. Speaker, the previous government put a Band-Aid on a problem. They did not have the courage to deal with that problem, Mr. Speaker. This government will deal with the issue of auto insurance.
Order. Order. The member for Lethbridge West is the one with the call.
Well, during this recession, Mr. Speaker, there's been an emerging consensus among economists from left to right that we need childcare as one of the recovery pillars because the kids are at home, not just the 0 to 5-year-olds, but all of them. It's pretty darn hard to go back to work with school-aged kids. I'm not sure what the Minister of Finance's experience with children is, Mr. Speaker, but it is generally frowned upon to leave an 8-year-old by themselves all day. But when I asked the Minister of Finance if he's thought about this issue as part of the economic recovery, his answer was, nah, not really. So will the Minister of Finance take childcare seriously as part of our economic stimulus and recovery, or is the only economic stimulus they the one where they take Justin Trudeau's?
I see the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP's behaviour in this place is ridiculous. They want to talk about what they're doing for Albertans. Again, on March 17th, 2020, the very day the state of emergency was declared in this province, their deputy leader, their acting leader inside this legislature, by her own words, Mr. Speaker, sent out a fundraising letter to fundraise to Albertans to pay the NDP's bills using COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, for political purposes, signing with her MLA title, Mr. Speaker, and that member wants to stand in this House and lecture on the process that they go. Shame on them, Mr. Speaker. Shame on that member for not standing up to her deputy leader. Shame on...
Order. The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View. Honourable members, at 2:01, a point of order has been called. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Give Grandma a hug. That's the takeaway from the Calgary Herald columnist Don Braid after what can only be described as a very cold-hearted assessment of who is at risk of COVID-19 by the Premier. The Premier seemed to imply we're out of the woods because the average age of victims of COVID-19 is 83. It's this same callous attitude towards seniors that led to this government's abject failure to manage the pandemic in seniors' care facilities. So did the Premier. Will you apologize to all Albertans for your callous, heartless, and tone-deaf comments? The floor is yours.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I feel for the families who have lost a loved one during this pandemic, but our continuing care operators in this province have done a good job of protecting our residents throughout this unprecedented crisis with the support of AHS and the support of this government. And we've had 106 deaths in our continuing care facilities, Mr. Speaker, but it's important to compare that to Ontario. 1,600 deaths there in Ontario in their facilities. In Quebec, that's 2,700 deaths that they've seen. And we'll expand the review that we've announced earlier, the review of our continuing care legislation, to have a review of the response throughout the whole pandemic.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government promised a wage subsidy and increased staffing levels for folks working in continuing care weeks ago. In Alberta, 104 out of 139 COVID-19 related deaths are seniors in continuing care. This is a massive tragedy. It took the Minister of Health 7 full weeks to announce surge funding during the COVID-19 pandemic. The money still hasn't gone out the front door. Can the Premier please take charge and show some leadership in this?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And none of that is true. Over a month ago, on April 20th, I announced $7 million a month to increase the healthcare aides staffing and to top up their wages by $2 an hour. In addition, I recently announced $170 million in new funding for continuing care facilities and as well the seniors' lodges, along with the Honourable Minister of Seniors and Housing. $14.5 million will be allocated per month, and the funding is retroactive to March 15th, Mr. Speaker. And that earlier announcement also included an advance of $24.5 million for 1,000 new aid positions, which has been received by the facilities.
The Honourable Member.
the money isn't in the workers' pockets for sure. This government promised that PPE would be provided to seniors' care facilities months ago. Frontline workers are reporting dangerous levels of shortage. This has to stop before more lives are lost. Will the Premier show leadership, admit that mistakes were made, and agree to immediately provide a full complement of PPE to all continuing care homes? And will he also commit to taking part in a national investigation into our failure to protect seniors in continuing care during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the more than 400 continuing care facilities throughout the province, some of them at the beginning of the pandemic did procure their own PPE. AHS has also helped them throughout the pandemic response to provide them with their PPE. That includes our seniors lodges in the province, Mr. Speaker. Very happy to be able to report to the Assembly that AHS has done an amazing job to make sure that the PPE is getting out the door and getting into the hands of our frontline workers in those continuing care facilities, the designated supportive living facilities in the province, and the seniors lodges, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, the continuing care review that we announced in 2019 will include our pandemic response.
The honourable member for Airdrie East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Physical fitness and exercise are an important part of our health and well-being. Small boutique gyms offer services that allow people to continue exercising safely during COVID-19 and offer some routine in a world tossed around and upside down. To the Minister of Health, will you consider advocating on behalf of small boutique gyms to open during the Phase 2 of Alberta's relaunch?
The Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we are following the advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, who is acting on the best evidence that's available to our public health officials to protect Albertans. And our restrictions are in place to minimize risk of transmission of COVID as we relaunch and as the relaunch continues. Now, we have heard the concerns, as the Honourable Member mentions, and the opinions expressed of Albertans who are concerned about exploring whether we can support some of the supporting sporting and indoor fitness activities to safely allow them in Stage 3. And no decisions have been made, but we will be considering that in the next EMCC meeting.
Well, member for Airdrie East.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that small boutique gyms have a lower capacity than the big box gyms that are included in Phase 3, and given that there are major differences between the big box gyms and small boutique gyms, and further given that these gyms operate in a controlled environment with set class times where only active members that have pre-registered can attend, Minister, what steps can small gyms take to shift them into Phase 2 of the relaunch instead of Phase 3?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think the Honourable Member makes a fantastic point. We know that gym operators are committed to health and safety and protecting the well-being of their clients and their patrons who can attend their gyms. Whenever they are allowed to open, the gyms will need to commit to following certain guidance provided by Alberta Health, and as well as taking all the appropriate precautions to minimize the risk of transmission in their facilities as relaunch continues, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And given that many small gym and fitness boutique owners are willing to commit to specific safety standards for their fitness studios, and given that over 13,000 people have signed an online petition to shift these small businesses into Phase 2 of the relaunch, Minister, can small gyms gain an industry-wide commitment to abide by specific protocols and standards to protect the safety of their customers? Can they be considered for Phase 2 of Alberta's relaunch?
The Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Medical Officer of Health is exploring whether gyms and other indoor fitness centres can be included in Phase 2, and that recommendation will be coming to EMCC from her for consideration next week. And then whenever the decision is made, the gyms will need to follow the public health guidance from her and her office and take all appropriate precautions to minimize the risk of transmission in their facilities. And I look forward to that recommendation coming to EMCC next week, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, this government will introduce legislation that presumably follows through on their throne speech promise to reallocate millions from the Victims of Crime Fund to other purposes. I know victim serving agencies are extremely concerned about this proposal. Can the minister tell us which agencies serving victims he consulted with and why he is proceeding despite their objections?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, last year we met with thousands upon thousands of Albertans that have been victimized by crime, Mr. Speaker. From communities from Valley View to Coaldale to Drayton Valley, Mr. Speaker, we heard from Albertans that are living in fear, Mr. Speaker. We invited all of the members opposite to come hear about their record on crime, Mr. Speaker, and you know what they did? They refused to show up. They refuse to listen. This government will not do the same thing that they did and put their head in the sand. We are listening to people right now that are living in fear. We have people that literally sleep with an axe under their bed, Mr. Speaker. We're going to take action.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Given that the question was about listening to those who serve victims of crime, I'll try again. Given that the Victims of Crime Fund has supported the training of thousands of dedicated Alberta volunteers who are available day and night to support their neighbours, what does the Minister of Justice have to say to these dedicated volunteers after cutting their training?
Minister of Justice, Solicitor General.
Mr. Speaker, nothing shocks me anymore in this House. They refuse to listen to actual victims that came out by the thousands, Mr. Speaker. Thousands upon thousands came out to voice their concerns about NDP justice. Yet here they are again, Mr. Speaker, questioning the very people asking for help. That is what this is doing, Mr. Speaker. We're expanding the scope to include public safety. This is about, and I've tried to explain this concept before, more pie. More pie is a good thing. It's not an either or, Mr. Speaker. It's about improving the system. That's what we're going to do.
The Honourable Member.
Given that one of the programs that was meant to launch last year in order to spend money on victims of crime was supports for survivors of domestic violence, which was based on the incredibly successful Homefront model in Calgary, can the minister explain to Albertans why he doesn't think that this program is needed?
Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we went through this in estimates. And again, I look forward to introducing legislation here, hopefully later here today. Mr. Speaker, this government is focused on public safety, making sure people are not victimized, Mr. Speaker. We commend the good work that's being done to combat domestic violence and other issues, Mr. Speaker. This legislation is about more, Mr. Speaker. It's going to expand the scope. It's going to provide additional resources, Mr. Speaker, to keep people safe and to make sure we stop people being victimized and living in fear in their communities, Mr. Speaker. It's a shame that they didn't come and hear about their record, Mr. Speaker. I commend them. And again, hopefully at some point we'll do town halls. I'll invite them again to hear about their record.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
Less than 24 hours before Alberta businesses were about to open their doors on May 14th, the Premier announced Calgary and Brooks would not be reopening with the rest of the province. Now, we aren't arguing with that decision itself. The issue is the costs incurred by these businesses due to the Premier's lack of notice. We've been told by restaurant owners that they spent on average $10,000 getting ready to open, only to have much of that food spoil. Will this government be reimbursing these small businesses after the government pulled the rug out from under them?
The Honourable Minister of Finance and President of the Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, we are in constant communication with small businesses across the province. I want to acknowledge the incredible hardship that so many of our business owners and job creators, employers have faced over the last couple of months. We have rolled out a series of measures, but we're certainly prepared to do more as again, we consult with small business owners and understand what measure would be the most appropriate.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. Given this government has not offered any help to small businesses other than kicking the can down the road through deferrals and partial WCB, and given this government would rather let other levels of government take the lead on supporting business, including their new friend and donor Justin Trudeau, and given small businesses are desperate for direct financial support, will this government finally listen to the small business community and provide financial support in the form of grants to help with reopening and increase operating costs?
The Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we have already rolled out a series of programs to help small businesses, including, again, a $350 million measure that puts money directly in business owners. I find it pretty rich coming from the members of the opposition who were in government who didn't seem to care about business owners and job creators. Mr. Speaker, we are listening to job creators and business people in this province.
The Honourable Member.
Given June rent is only 4 days away, And given the Premier let his party's biggest donor, Justin Trudeau, take the lead on designing a rent subsidy program that doesn't work for the majority of Alberta businesses, and given this UCP government has refused to go back to the table to renegotiate the program, and given members of the business community recently sent a letter to this government asking for a commercial eviction ban, will this government finally step up and help small businesses and implement a commercial eviction ban?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we are participating in the Commercial Rent Assistance Program, and we have made recommendations to the federal minister to make improvements in the way that program could be administered. Mr. Speaker, we have brought forward a number of supports for small businesses. On a per capita basis, Alberta ranks amongst the top provinces with measures directly supporting small businesses. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to listen to the business community to understand what more might be required.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government believes in the value of inclusive education. This province truly believes in the importance of meeting the needs of every child. That is why we have kept our promise to maintain education funding. Many parents have questions about our changes to the program unit funding and whether that significantly decreases the access children have to the supports they need to ensure their children does well upon entering school. To the Minister of Education, how do you plan on ensuring every child's success, even those with developmental and cognitive disabilities in our school system?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. Despite the rhetoric coming from the other side of the House, school authorities continue to receive the funding they require to support their students. Program unit funding continues to provide supports for pre-K students, and students in kindergarten receive support through our new Specialized Learning Supports grant. We continue to recognize the importance of early intervention, and Alberta continues to have the earliest intervention program for children in Canada, ages 2 years, 8 months.
Hear, hear.
Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Our government acknowledges that learning begins long before a child enters a classroom. Given that many children with complex behaviors or disabilities require extra focus to prepare them for school, and given that many early childhood learning and development centres are well positioned to provide this level of assistance, to the Minister of Children's Services, what do the recent funding changes to these programs mean to these facilities?
Minister of Education. Of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last summer, I actually had the opportunity to visit the riding of my colleague from Lethbridge East and tour a child care centre that specializes in providing care for children with disabilities, so I know this is an issue that is very close to him as well as myself. Mr. Speaker, our government has maintained childcare funding specifically also for inclusive childcare. Inclusion can mean a variety of things, from supporting children with disabilities to ensuring that children have access to culturally appropriate childcare. My ministry works hard to ensure that children across this province are able to meaningfully participate regardless of their circumstances.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Given that our government cares deeply about this issue and that the ministers are working hard to address the concerns of parents, and given there is clearly a lot of misinformation being spread to the public about these changes, and given that parents who have children with complex needs already struggle to find and source the support needed, to the Minister again of Children's Services, how do you plan on making supports more accessible and easier to navigate for these families?
The Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you to the member for this very important question and for his advocacy on this issue. We are currently renegotiating the bilateral agreements on childcare with the federal government, and inclusion funding is a hugely critical part of these discussions. We have to ensure that educators have the skills and tools that they need to ensure that every child feels accepted, valued, and safe. Mr. Speaker, the former government's pilot project, and we've heard a lot about this in the last couple of weeks, spent $45 million on 2% of children and 4% of centres in Alberta. We'll take those dollars and make sure they go further, are invested more equitably, including to ensure inclusive daycare is available to all who need it.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs has a question to ask.
Mr. Speaker, in one way or another, everyone is hurting during this pandemic, but this government is intent on making a bad situation even worse. Just 3 days before the final applications were due, they put out a news release saying that they are cutting access to the Community Initiatives Project-Based Grants, or CIP. The arts generate over $5 billion for our economy and supports nearly 60,000 jobs. Can the minister explain how they are going to include the arts in our economic recovery if they insist on cutting their supports?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our top priority in this government, especially right now, is the health and safety of artists and performers and audience members all across Alberta. I'm sad to see that the NDP is using divisive politics for their agenda hurt the artists industry, creating fear in the sector and misleading the public. It's shameful, Mr. Speaker. They choose to destroy, debilitate, and fearmonger to achieve their ideological bent, while on this side, we're going to uplift, restart, and relaunch.
Well, Member for Edmonton Castle Downs.
Given that the government cut the program 3 days before the deadline through a notice on the government website, and given that workers in the industry have said that this move leaves them with no certainty on where any government program sits now, can the minister explain how she is in a position to deliver vital supports to these communities now?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The opposition continues to twist this narrative, and I just don't even really know how to answer these questions or quite to participate. The change to project-based funding is temporary. We've said this. In fact, that member has had regular meetings with my chief of staff with respect to this information directly. I find it really, really important that on top of having that information and then going to the media and spreading misinformation, actually hurting the organizations. Right now, project funding is what these organizations told us that they needed. It's temporary. We will move back into programs when it's safe to do so.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your ministry hasn't provided answers or response to the actors and actresses and artists that are asking for these answers. Given that by cutting access to the SIP program, the governments feel the groups of Albertans who generate $5 billion for GDP of Alberta and create over 60,000 jobs need to be part of our economy, and given that the Minister of Finance has said that diversification is a luxury, can the minister tell the House if she shares the views that artists, of who she is one, don't have anything to contribute to an economic discussion?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Castle Downs. If you're ever curious to know what a preamble was, that's a very good example of one. The Honourable Minister of Culture and Multiculturalism.
Mr. Speaker, I find this line of questioning really rich. Here is a member who allowed her and her friends to attack Paul Brandt, a gem of this province, a musician by him, an amazing musician who was actually brought onto the Human Trafficking Task Force to bring his expertise, and yet stands there and wants to defend artists, and yet is willing to attack a person who is coming on board to use his talent and his arts to actually help and forward information on human trafficking. Further to that, the member could have avoided yet another embarrassing public situation simply because she chooses not to listen to the truth. $26.9 million will continue to fund the arts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to spending millions of dollars on an embarrassing war room or accepting donations from Justin Trudeau, the UCP is all in. But when it comes to finding monies for the reopening of childcare centres, they can only give out penny change. Childcare operators have called the one-time $66 per space funding from this government an insult, a slap in the face, and utterly meaningless. It's a few $1,000s when centres have been closed for months, and many will continue to be for many more months to come. As childcare centres struggle to reopen, can the minister explain why she hasn't been able to offer actual, substantive support for childcare operators and educators?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Childcare is an important part of getting Albertans back to work. As a working mom, I know this firsthand. I'm so glad we were able to redirect and provide $18 million to support childcare centres through this pandemic, which on a number of the 5 town hall sessions that we hosted with operators is exactly what they asked for, to redirect those funds that would typically be going to childcare centres so that they could reopen for parents. We're working with the federal government. I know those centres had access to hundreds of millions of dollars in programming, and we'll continue to work with them on this.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that many childcare programs still have not reopened or will be operating in a reduced capacity for the foreseeable future, and given that the minister is going to continue to find savings in the coming months as there are fewer families accessing subsidy and far fewer educators who are receiving top-ups, can the minister tell the House what she's doing with all of the money in childcare budget if she's not using it to prevent our childcare system from going under?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Now, my last response I wasn't able to get to. We are actually hearing from childcare centres, and I'd like to quote a Neil from Kids U. This is a meaningful commitment to childcare in Alberta and will help us prepare to reopen safely. While we have been open in a few locations for essential workers, our staff all over Calgary can't wait to see our kids and families again soon and navigate this new normal together. Mr. Speaker, we've taken a prudent approach. We continue to gather feedback from centres on where the gaps are with the federal and provincial programming. We're working on what those supports may look like, but rest assured we are working with centre directors and frontline workers to support families.
The Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, well, given that approach is actually betting on the demise of our childcare system, and given that the UCP government will be receiving another $45 million from the federal government in a transfer as part of the Early Learning and Childcare Centre bilateral agreement, and given that affordable, accessible, and reliable childcare should be a key pillar for the economic recovery of this province, will this minister commit to using this money to actually develop a long-term strategy, not a Band-Aid solution, a long-term strategy to help rebuild and strengthen our childcare system?
Minister of Children's Services.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. This is what I've been saying time and time again. We are incredibly committed to accessibility, affordability, high-quality childcare for parents who need it. We are working with the federal government. What we won't do, Mr. Speaker, though, is redirect $46 million of a bilateral agreement to support 4% of child care centres across the province. We've heard that in this pandemic, that has created an even disproportionate amount of struggle for those centres who were not the chosen winners of the NDP's pilot program. We will continue to work with the federal minister and listen to feedback of operators to reopen for parents.
The Honourable Member for Banff, Kananaskis.
Mr. Speaker, we're beginning to realize the repercussions of the safety measures that were put in place for COVID-19. These repercussions are felt strongly in our agri-food industry. Cattle farmers have been devastated by the limited production capacity of JBS and Cargill processing facilities. Production was backed up 130,000 head, and beef prices plummeted 40% as a result, all while ranchers had to pay extra to hold their calves for a longer period of time until the backlog cleared. So to the Minister of Agriculture, can you please tell this House what we've already done to help protect the cattle industry?
The Honourable, the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think everybody in this chamber and Albertans across the province know that Alberta beef is the best in the world, and it's produced in the most sustainable way, better than anywhere else. But COVID-19 did have significant disruptions to our cattle processing. Nearly 3 months ago, there was a first case of COVID at Harmony Meats. And since then, tremendous amount of work from cross-departmental agencies have been there to make sure that our cattle industry can do what they do best, and that is to feed the world. And since then, we have created a cattle set-aside program that will help the price fluctuations that we're seeing due to those processing disruptions.
The Honourable Member for Banff, Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Well, as mentioned, given that our government recently committed $17 million to fund extended holding of fed slaughter-ready cattle, but that 90% of these eligible cattle are not held on family ranches, so supports don't help them. So given that the small family ranch is the vital beginning of our food chain, and given that many family ranches are in dire need of support, to the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, if these backlogs continue into the fall, what can you offer the ranchers of Bragg Creek, Jumping Pound, Millerville, and beyond, so they can continue fueling our world as all the existing supports are funneled directly to large feedlots and processing facilities?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we will continue to monitor the cow-calf prices going into this fall and winter. It's something that the fed cattle prices right now are the most urgent need, and so that's why we have created a set-aside program for them. But later on this year, if conditions warrant, we will make sure that there's a set-aside program in place for them. But just when it comes to March calf prices, there was a decrease in 7%, roughly $88 per head. But we have seen the past month a rebound of about 5%, which is about $63 a head. So it is something that there is a strengthening in the market, but we will continue to monitor and help out our cattle producers.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Well, insurance premiums on cattle have also continued to rise since the creation of the WCPIP calf insurance in 2012. So given the uncertainty of the post-COVID-19 world and the aforementioned industry crisis within our processing facilities, and given that many of the cattlemen in the foothills raise calves for sale rather than for feeder cows, and given that the window of opportunity to sell these calves is small in the fall and in the spring, to the same Minister, how does the Alberta government plan on maintaining affordable insurance solutions for our cattle industry?
Minister.
Speaker, and we have seen that in the Western Livestock Price Insurance Program, that insurance premiums did go up about 250% compared to last year. And insurance is the best way and the best kind of business risk management for our agriculture sector. So we are looking at improvements to possibly creating a new cattle price insurance program, but ultimately we want to make sure that actually works for our ranchers. And Mr. Speaker, our agriculture sector is so important to our economic recovery, and we want to make sure that we are there to support them every step along the way.
Honourable member for Edmonton Meadows is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Human trafficking is a scourge that it's critical that we tackle. Our caucus supported the creation of the task force, and we look forward to reviewing the work that it shall do. I'm hearing concerns from multicultural communities that their voices and experiences are not represented on this panel. Can the Minister of Justice explain why there is not a single person from the East Asian, South Asia, Filipino communities on this task force, and will he rectify this by appointing a member of these communities as soon as possible?
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. We'll continue to make sure that we engage with all Albertans on with this task force, Mr. Speaker. If the member has community members that have ideas, suggestions of how we can improve policy, Mr. Speaker, we'll gladly facilitate those introductions to make sure that they can bring those ideas forward to the task force, Mr. Speaker. It's there to help provide advice to our government to make sure we take this really critical issue seriously and find ways to improve lives for Albertans.
The Honourable member for Edmonton Meadows.
Given that these communities have been impacted by human trafficking, and given that their experience and voices could contribute greatly to the work of panel and only add to the panel's work and improve its outcomes, so will the Minister of Justice release the criteria they use to make these appointments so Albertans can see why these communities were excluded from the task force, and will he commit to reviewing these criteria to avoid such an oversight in the future?
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice, Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, like I was mentioning earlier on, if the Honourable member has suggestions of people that the task force should be speaking with, or suggestions of different community leaders that should be engaged in this matter, we gladly welcome those suggestions and ideas. Mr. Speaker, we don't see this as a partisan issue. This is about how we can make lives better for Albertans. We welcome their suggestions, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that tackling human trafficking needs involve all Albertans, no voices should be excluded from participating with the task force. But given the concern that I have heard from the East and South Asian and Filipino communities about their lack of representation on this task force, will the Minister of Justice apologize to these communities for failing to include a single member of the communities on the panel and commit to rectifying it immediately? Will he report back to this House once this glaring oversight is resolved?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've provided in olive branch to find different ways to work together on this, provide different feedback to the community. I'd also invite the Honourable member and all the members opposite to join us in condemning how Paul Brandt was attacked, Mr. Speaker, when he was appointed to this task force. Mr. Speaker, this is an individual who was given countless hours, time, resources to combat human trafficking with his Not in My City initiative, Mr. Speaker. This is somebody of the highest regard who's going to help elevate the profile of this issue, Mr. Speaker. We ask the NDP to join us in condemning the attacks on Paul Brandt.
The Honourable member for Edmonton Decore has a question.
When it comes to small businesses asking for support, this government's only response is to delay and defer. Businesses have been asking this government to provide commercial eviction protections. We know half of small businesses are not able to pay June's rent without help, so our caucus asked the government to step up and introduce a commercial eviction ban. This government's response? An online survey to businesses to provide feedback on commercial rent. Mr. Speaker, they had been listening. They know small businesses had already given their feedback. So will the government commit to a commercial rent ban immediately? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, along with every single other province and territory, we have signed on to the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. It is a federal program that all provinces are taking part in. The Premier and my colleague, the Minister of Finance, are continuing to raise the concerns Albertans have about the program with the federal government. We have recently launched an online engagement tool that will allow us to gauge the depth of the problem facing commercial tenants and landlords, so we're making informed decisions. The members opposite may not believe in engaging with tenants and landlords as they act based on ideology, not fact.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton to Court.
Well, given that the UCP failed to listen to businesses when they asked for guidance on relaunch and left them waiting hours before the relaunch occurred, given again that this government pulled the rug out from under Calgary businesses by waiting until the last possible moment to cancel their relaunch, costing them thousands, and given that now, rather than supporting small businesses, this government is trying to tie them up in red tape with a survey to gather information they'd already have if they bothered to listen, will the Minister of Red Tape explain why, during an economic crisis, he's allowing red tape rather than listening to businesses?
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I find it rich that this member all of a sudden has a deep interest in red tape reduction. This is the party that had zero interest in reducing even one-for-one red tape reduction when we introduced it in opposition. What our government is doing is we're getting rid of 1/3 of the regulatory burden against our job creators and everyday Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton to Court.
Well, given that this government is spending $13 million on a Department of Red Tape reduction, and given that this government's cost businesses in Calgary thousands of dollars because of this government's failure to plan, and given that this department apparently can't be bothered to engage with businesses and hear their concerns that they're raising, choosing instead to have struggling business owners fill out surveys, will the Minister of Red Tape just admit his department has failed the constituents it was created to serve? Rather than wasting money on redundant surveys, how about donate your entire department budget to help support those small businesses?
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is that this government has said we will have a major focus on red tape reduction. This is because we understand that in order for Albertans to get back to work, we need to get off the backs of our job creators. And this is what this government will do over the next 3 years for sure, to be able to make sure that we have 1/3 reduction. But we'll also make sure that we reduce the compliance costs as well, so that Albertans know that their job creators will not have the government on their back.
For Red Deer South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The panel report of the supervised consumption site is public to Albertans. The fixation of the prior government on harm reduction was a failure. They failed to begin with the end in mind, supporting those seeking to become free from addictions. The aftermath is this: tragic human loss, destruction to businesses, and tearing social fabric in our communities. To the Minister, what were the consequences to Albertans from the panel findings of the NDP consumption sites?
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for raising such a great question. When the Supervised Consumption Service Review Panel concluded their report, after consulting over 19,000 Albertans, the evidence is very strong. It left with a community with increased needle debris everywhere, increased deaths and crime, and lack of transparency, accountability for the site of operation. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you, it was a big disappointment that the conclusion is the current system is a chaos. That is the record that left by the NDP government.
The Honourable Member for Red Deer South.
Given the NDP imposed a drug consumption site on the city of Red Deer, disregarding civic leaders, businesses, and families, given the NDP drug consumption site lacked focus on supporting individuals seeking to become free from addictions, given there has been an exodus of businesses from our downtown due to consequences from the NDP drug consumption site, to the Minister, will this government provide hope for the harms caused to our community from the NDP drug consumption site?
Honourable, the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the one-term failed one-pillar NDP government, we are developing a full continuum care for addiction recovery. We're focusing on helping our Albertans get out of addiction and live on a life that is healthy, constructive, as positively engaged citizens. Mr. Speaker, we're going to take every chance and every opportunity to take a community by community, city by city approach to clean up the mess NDP left for us.
Honourable Member.
Thank you. Given that the best thing we can do for our neighbors under addictions is to love and support them becoming free from addictions, given the result of the NDP policy encouraged and supported individuals to live in their addictions, given this government's focus on supporting and encouraging individuals to become free from addictions, to the Minister, how will the panel report inform a principled course correction towards loving and supporting our neighbours seeking to become free from addictions?
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't be more agreeable to the honourable member's conclusion. Yes, we are going to be laser focused on helping people get out of addiction, focused on treatment, focused on recovery. This government had set a goal. We're going to create 4,000 additional new spaces for people to access treatment. As of today, we've accomplished 3,000 of the 4,000 target already. Today, in Alberta, it's never been before that Albertans who want to access treatment within 3 to 7 days, we can offer that.
Introduction of bills.
The Honourable, the Minister of Education. Just let them roll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to introduce Bill 15, the Choice in Education Act 2020. This legislation is, if passed, will protect and strengthen choice within a vibrant and diversified education system through amendments to the Education Act. This proposed legislation will affirm that parents, not politicians, have the right to choose the kind of education they feel will be best for their children. This bill shows our government's commitment to offering education options that allows parents to select the path they feel will best help their children reach their full potential. With this legislation, we are protecting Alberta's long history of education choice, including public and separate schools, francophone schools, charter schools, independent schools, early childhood education, and home education. I look forward to discussing and debating this important bill in the legislature in the near future. Thank you.
Honourable members, the Honourable, the Minister of Education has moved first reading of the Choice in Education Act 2020. Those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 15, Choice in Education Act 2020 is now read a first time.
Yeah. Go ahead. The Honourable, the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to introduce Bill 16, Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act. If passed, this bill will ensure victims have the support they need, promote public safety, and prevent crime. We've heard time and time again at our town halls, Mr. Speaker, the fact that victims felt as though they weren't fully served in this province, Mr. Speaker, people that were living in fear in communities. These amendments, Mr. Speaker, will help strengthen the ability of us to provide public safety in the province of Alberta, Mr. Speaker. Again, we've got a lot of folks moving around right now. I ask that we move first reading of Bill 16, the Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020.
You guys go ahead and grab the original copy. It's okay. Come around. And if you just want to take this to the table, it's okay. Just drop it off. Thank you. Honourable members, the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General has moved first reading of the Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act. Those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 16, Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act 2020 is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
I see the Honourable Government House Leader has a tabling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to submit the appropriate amount of reports to table of a letter that I provided to the Opposition House Leader that outlines the requirements of the current government caucus and my office to communicate in writing between us and the opposition for this point forward.
Are there other tablings? Not sure. No other tablings?
Clerk. Deferred.
Honourable members, we are at points of order, and at 2:01, the Honourable the member for Calgary Mountain View raised a point of order, and I believe the Honourable member for Edmonton Millwoods will be arguing it on her behalf.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the member from Calgary Mountain View, the point of order is under 23J, uses abusive or insulting language of a nature likely to create disorder. During debate, the member from Cardston-Siksika yelled at the member from Lethbridge West, "Simmer down, kitty cat." And the member from Lethbridge West has assured me that she is nobody's kitty cat, and certainly not his. This language is completely inappropriate in this House, and we request that the member apologize and withdraw.
The Government House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do not have the benefits of the blues. At that time that the Honourable member from Lethbridge East, I believe, I get they're both Lethbridge West, I apologize, Mr. Speaker, was speaking. I was actually answering the question, I believe, at that moment. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I certainly couldn't hear anything over top of the opposition screaming, is how I would describe it at me while I was attempting to speak inside the chamber, Mr. Speaker. So I'm at a disadvantage. I don't sit near the member from Lethbridge West. I'm not on that side of the House, so I don't know what may or may not have been said. And at this point, I'd have to refer to you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the blues, or I don't know how you do a point of order on something that wasn't in Hansard.
Thank you, honourable members. Is there anyone else wishing to provide an interjection? Seeing none, I would say that I did not hear that interjection. I would, though, say, if in fact the member for Cardston-Siksika said what is reportedly said, that it would be reasonable for him to withdraw and apologize. However, it's impossible for me to know whether in fact that is what he said, as I myself did not hear that. So I will leave it in the honourable member's hands to apologize and withdraw if he did. I consider that point of order dealt with and concluded. We are at a point of privilege, and the Honourable Official Opposition House Leader has raised one.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 15 subsection 2, this morning I provided written notice to the Speaker to your office of my intention to raise a point of privilege here today. The issue of media receiving technical briefings ahead of opposition members and staff. Last night we were informed that effective immediately, opposition briefings in advance of a bill being tabled were cancelled until further notice. Briefings on upcoming legislation were then cancelled by the ministers, including the opposition briefing of Bill 15, the Choice of Education Act, which would have occurred shortly after the Assembly met this morning. However, at 10:15 this morning, the media received an embargo technical briefing on the bill, followed by a news conference with the Alberta education representatives. As a result, the first opportunity for the members of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition to view Bill 15, as well as Bill 16, was after the bill was introduced just a few minutes ago. This means that the members of the media will have had an additional 4 hours of the legislation that non-government members of this Assembly, and also will have the opportunity to have asked questions. Now, this is the first opportunity to raise this matter as per Section 115 in Bouchain. We were aware of the media briefing that was occurring this morning, and until the notification the government would be cancelling opposition briefs and cancellation notices began in our inbox, though the privilege of the members as ruled by Speaker Kowalski in 2003 was being upheld at the time, information would be shared with members of the opposition at the 9:30 this morning. However, the cancellation of the opposition briefings changed that and led us to where we are now. As there was no cancellation of the media briefing, it is clear that members of the media had the opportunity to access the contents of the bill prior to the members of the Assembly. We would therefore submit that our privilege as members of the Assembly, and indeed the privilege of the Assembly as a whole, were in fact breached. Mr. Speaker, the concept of privilege as it applies to the members of Parliament throughout the Commonwealth is one of fundamental tenets of parliamentary democracy. Section 24 of Bouchain's 6th edition on page 11 states, "Parliamentary privilege is the sum of the peculiar rights enjoyed by each House collectively as the constituent part of the High Court of Parliament, and by members of each House individually, without which they do not discharge their functions and which exceeds those possessed by other bodies or individuals." And Section 24 goes on to quote Sir Ernst May, stating, "The privileges of Parliament are rights which are absolutely necessary for the due execution of its powers." They are enjoyed by individual members because the House cannot perform its function without unimpeded use of the services of its members, and by each House for the protection of its members and the vindication of its own authority and dignity. This is the critical nature of the concept of privilege. It has been a consistent finding of speakers passed throughout the Commonwealth that breaches of privilege are among the most serious contraventions of our processes and practices. Privilege is important. In fact, that the commencement of every parliament, the new elected speaker, in the name of and on behalf of the members, lay claim by humble petition to the members' ancient and undoubted rights and privileges. These are more than just words, more than ceremony, tradition, and formality. Through those words that have been uttered over the centuries, the importance of privilege is reinforced. In this specific case, Mr. Speaker, the abilities of the members of the opposition to conduct their duties were obstructed, and therefore I would submit that important democratic functions of the Assembly were impaired. I believe that the government has committed a contempt of the Assembly by providing information about legislation being read in the House and without offering the opposition members a similar opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the breaches committed by the government extend beyond the realm of breach of privilege to the very serious issue of contempt. Chapter 15 on page 251 of Erskine May opens with these words. Generally speaking, any act or admission which obstructs or impedes either the House of Parliament in the performance of its functions, or which obstructs or impedes any member or officer of the House in the discharge of his duty, or which has tendency, direct or indirectly, to produce such results, may be treated as a contempt, even though there is no precedent of the offence. Further, House of Commons Practice and Procedures on page 60 makes it clear that a contempt may be an act or admission. It does not have to actually obstruct or impede the House or a member. It merely has to have the tendency to provide such results. Mr. Speaker, I submit to you that failing to provide briefings on legislation to the members of the opposition, yet offering that opportunity to media, in fact, in advance of the introduction of said legislation to the House, has impeded members of this House in the discharge of our duties. It is not unreasonable to assume that the members of the media will ask members of the opposition for their opinion on legislation today, but we will be unable to answer. We will be unable to answer to the people of Alberta in advance of the media. We will be playing catch-up. The government's failure to provide us with the information directly impairs our ability to discharge our duties as a member of the opposition. This situation we are currently finding ourselves in is virtually identical to the scenario described as unacceptable by the House of Commons Speaker Peter Milliken on page 1840 and 1841 of the House of Commons debate on March 19, 2001, when he said, "To deny to members information concerning business that is about to come before the House, while at the same time providing such information to the media that will likely be questioning members about that business, is a situation that the Chair cannot condone." Speaker Milliken further ruled on March 22, 2011, on page 9113 of the House of Commons debate, the member is currently not misguided in his expectation that members of the House, individually and collectively, must receive from the government particular types of information required for the fulfillment of their parliamentary duties before it is shared elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, this issue has come up in our Assembly as well. On March 4th, 2003, the Leader of the NDP opposition raised a point of privilege under circumstances identical to this one we are dealing with today. In his ruling, Speaker Kowalski on page 304 of Hansard agreed that Speaker Milliken's conclusions and ruled that the disclosure of the contents of a bill to the media prior to the same information being shared with members of the opposition constitutes a prima facie contempt of the Assembly and is treated in the way as a breach of privilege. Mr. Speaker, the ruling ought to stand as a precedent in this House as basis for how the government ought to conduct itself. The constituents that we represent demand it. Particularly in this situation we currently have in the House, the opposition is the only thing standing in the way of government passing legislation without scrutiny. And currently in the House, there is only one opposition. Yet this government, who holds a significant majority, continues to attempt to obstruct the abilities of the opposition to do their job. Whether that is withholding briefings, having government staff stand watch over budget lockups, limiting access to officials during lockups, taking away 30 hours of estimates, or ramming through legislation in short periods of time, this government continuously impedes the opposition. Mr. Speaker, the issue of sharing government information publicly or with the media before members of the opposition has come up before both in this Assembly and elsewhere. Over and over again, governments try to find ways to forward their agenda, and this government has been inventive indeed in doing so. The tradition of this House demands that the privilege of the members of the loyal opposition be upheld and be protected. It is incumbent on the Speaker to provide clear direction to this House, and I believe I have provided compelling arguments that the actions of this government are in contempt of this House and that the events outlined constitute a prima facie case of privilege, and I ask that you, in keeping with the Speaker Kowalski's ruling, rule accordingly.
Thank you, the official opposition House Leader, for your submissions. As all members know, accusations of a contempt of the legislature and a point of privilege are matters that this House takes seriously. And it has been the tradition of our Assembly to provide the government House Leader the opportunity, or others, to respond to the point of privilege. And typically speaking, they can choose to defer their response or make a response on the day of the submission as well. So I will leave that up to the government House Leader. Are you prepared to respond at this time? The Honourable, the government House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am prepared to respond today. I have a couple points that I would like to address in regards to the official opposition House Leader's points. The first, where I would like to start off with, is my office received notice of this point of privilege today at 11:32 a.m. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will note that it's 4 minutes after your office received notice of it. However, I've also been informed that the media notice was sent out by the official opposition a full hour in advance of informing your office. Now, I'm disappointed, of course, first of all, Mr. Speaker, that once again they would choose to share their intentions with the media before either your office or mine, and disrespect, particularly from my perspective, the Speaker's office as well as this chamber. In fact, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I may consider raising a point of privilege myself next week as to whether this amounts to contempt of this Assembly, since I question if the official opposition House Leader was able, by providing, I should say, notice to your office at 11:28 to your office, did in fact provide notice at the earliest opportunity to this Assembly and to your office, if she was able to provide notice to the media a full 60 minutes prior to that. This, I think, is important to this point of privilege, because the New Democrats have a pattern of disrespecting independent officers of the legislature, such as the Ethics Commissioner and the Chief Electoral Officer. And, Mr. Speaker, have had a pattern of disrespecting, from my perspective, you and your role inside this chamber, with tweets and different things that I could refer to in May next week. I quote, though, the Ethics Commissioner report from the October 23, 2019 report that she provided the Assembly. She said, in the future, it would be appreciated if those requesting an investigation did not post the request to social media before I have the courtesy of receiving the request. She also says, I want to make it clear that I do not want members filing complaints against other members for the purpose of scoring political points. Sound familiar, Mr. Speaker? The NDP have also questioned the integrity of the Chief Electoral Officer, as noted by the Ethics Commissioner in her April 27, 2020 report. She says it is suggested that this transfer has the potential of impacting investigations. These are serious and unfounded allegations against the Chief Electoral Officer, who is an independent officer of this legislature and is sworn to carry out his statutory duties, clearly condemning the NDP's behaviour of using independent officers of this chamber for political purposes. My second point, Mr. Speaker, is I noticed that the notice that was provided does not make clear which privilege is alleged to have been breached. I listened to the Honourable Member's remarks, and still not fully clear what privilege she says has been breached, so hopefully my remarks do remain on point. For the benefit of those at home, though, page 89 of the House of Commons Procedure and Practices lists the following privileges for members that each of us members has as individuals of this chamber. We each have the freedom of speech. That is our right. We each have freedom from arrest in civil matters. We have exemption from jury duty. So if any of you get a notice in the mail, call Parliamentary Counsel. You have exemption from being subpoenaed to attend court as a witness. And you have the freedom from obstruction, interference, and intimidation. Now, I assume that the member is alleging that by cancelling opposition bill briefings, the government is breaching a member's right to be free from interference. I should note that nowhere, absolutely nowhere in the House of Commons Procedures and Practices does it note that a member has a right to a bill briefing. What members have a right to do is to be the first to see the final form of a bill, which is on notice when it is introduced in the Assembly. They do not have a right to demand to see the final form of a bill before first reading. They certainly have no right or privilege to receive a bill briefing before the media, or with the media, or frankly after the media. The government has on occasion seen value in offering technical bill briefings to the opposition. If the government chooses to withdraw a technical briefing, which they were under no obligation to provide in the first place, they can so do so. In fact, if the MLA for Edmonton Manning is arguing that by withdrawing technical briefings we have caused hardship for the official opposition, then I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that they should perhaps reflect on how we ended up in this situation. Because this isn't the first time that technical briefings have been refused to the official opposition in the 30th legislature. Back in the fall sitting, the MLA for Edmonton Strathcona intentionally chose to break confidential information she had received on a bill briefing for Bill 22 prior to its introduction in the Assembly, by using that information in question period before that bill was even placed inside this House. After that outrageous breach of convention by the member for Edmonton Strathcona, the government withdrew technical briefings for the remainder of the fall sitting. At a later meeting with the official opposition, they requested that I reinstate those technical bill briefings, and I did agree. Fast forward now to Monday and Tuesday of this week. The official opposition approached my office about securing the government's support for an amendment to Government Motion 19. We had originally offered 11 ministers to participate in a COVID-19 debate, and the opposition told us they only had questions for 4 ministers, and asked instead that we would increase the time for ministers to be questioned up to 50 minutes after their opening statements instead of 15 minutes. Let me read from yesterday's votes and proceedings the amendment moved by the member for Edmonton Manning, who has moved the point of privilege today. And it's hard to follow unless you have the motion with you, Mr. Speaker, but I do know that you will follow it because you were in the chair when it was moved. And it says A in Clause D, by striking out any other member of Executive Council may, and substituting it with the Minister of Health, the President of the Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Labour and Immigration, and the Minister of Education may each then. This demonstrates that the government accepted an increase in the amount of time that was allowed for the questions answered as requested by the official opposition, and agreed to the ministers that they requested at that time. Also of interest, I do believe, is the remarks made by the member for Edmonton Manning, where she made no reference to expecting other ministers to participate. A portion of those remarks, Mr. Speaker, you can find on page 799 of yesterday's Alberta Hansard. And I'm quoting her now. We identified 4 ministers that have definitely been taking the lead in regards to addressing the pandemic. So we wanted to give an opportunity for those ministers to be able to have a little bit more time to respond. At no time in her remarks in Hansard you could see that she referred to wanting other ministers to speak. Now I have to say, Mr. Speaker, at the time I thought it was an odd request, but it was a request that the opposition made of us, and I was willing to agree. Then, yesterday, after we debated in this House until 6:30 in the evening, which is over 6 hours of debate on the COVID motion, the member for Edmonton Manning released a statement that said, these ministers outright refused to respond to the concerns we heard from Albertans. After weeks away from the legislature, they chose not to be held accountable. Mr. Speaker, I will point out all of those ministers sat in this chamber for a question period yesterday and were certainly prepared to answer the questions. The member for Edmonton Goldbar and Edmonton Strathcona would later tweet out about the absence of ministers. And I quote, I will be telling my constituents who was in the room for the debate yesterday. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know I will be sharing with my constituents who was in the room for the debate, and I will not break parliamentary protocol and tradition by referring to the absence of any member, but I will certainly be referring to where the member for Edmonton Goldbar was with my constituents, as well as the member for Strathcona. And I would point out, Mr. Speaker, that Albertans can look at the record with Hansard and will clearly know who was in the chamber yesterday debating legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I find actions like that from the official opposition to be reprehensible and disingenuous at best. When I go home to my constituents this weekend, I know they will have words for that behavior, and I would be surprised if I could share those remarks in this chamber. My constituents also know that actions have consequences, and you reap what you sow. In closing, Speaker Zajewski, in his October 31st, 2013 ruling, which you can find, Mr. Speaker, on page 2,655 of Alberta Hansard for that day, notes the following, and I'm quoting the Speaker now. However, I also stressed the importance of ensuring that members are the first to see the proposed legislation in its final form, before a bill is disclosed to outside parties. That a quote that the Speaker is referring to in his ruling can be found originally on page 58 of Alberta Hansard for May 29, 2012, the year before he was being quoted. But the key point here, Mr. Speaker, is this: in its final form. At that time, and also with the case that is before this chamber today, there was no factual basis to actually conclude that an explicit, verbatim details or provisions of that bill were disclosed. Accordingly, it was held that the member's ability to perform her functions in that instance had not been impeded. I would like to point out that not every statement about a bill that is on notice will automatically lead to a qualified prima facie case of privilege, as you well know, Mr. Speaker. And I want to reiterate that the government has never shared the final form of a bill with the media prior to being introduced in the Assembly, and therefore is there in no way this rises to the threshold of a prima facie breach of privilege.
Honourable members, is there any other submissions? Seeing none, I would like to provide some comments with respect to the point of privilege and the submissions made today. As honourable members will know, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta has spent significant time studying privilege, studying precedents here in our chamber, and I am quite familiar with this particular point of privilege and the instances in which it has been raised previously. And so I want to share with the Assembly some of the things that I will be taking into consideration with respect to my decision. I was inclined to rule this afternoon after being familiar with the situation from previous study, but given some of the submissions, I am willing to take some time and consider that. I would like to note a number of the things that I will be considering and express some of my concerns. I too received notice of the point of privilege at 10:31 via press release of the NDP caucus. I can share with the NDP caucus that was disappointing to the Speaker to receive notice of a point of privilege through press release and not through the most courteous fashion and appropriate fashion, which would be official notice to my office, which I did not receive until, as noted in the submissions today, 11:28. I will consider whether or not this was, in fact, the first time in which, and at the earliest notice that could have been provided to the Assembly of the point of privilege, given that notice was, in fact, provided to the media prior to the Speaker or to members of the Assembly. I will also consider Speaker Swazdeski's statements of December 2nd, 2014, when he said there's no specific right to have the government brief members on the content of a bill. I will also consider the comments made in 2013 when it says, when the then Speaker said, accordingly, there was no release of the bill, which in this case, there clearly hasn't been, or any technical briefing provided to persons who were not members of the, prior to its introduction. Now we've heard submissions from the Honourable, the official opposition House Leader, that in fact there was a technical briefing that took place. So I will consider what may or may not have transpired at that reported technical briefing, if in fact the submission made by the Honourable Government House Leader is correct, that there was no technical briefing with respect to a introduction of the bill to members of the media and not members of the Assembly, then perhaps there hasn't been a breach, but I will take into consideration the possibility that in fact there has been a breach, in which case it is possible that we would find a contempt for the Parliament. I will also take into consideration, and I think this point has raised a number of other additional questions, in that if we are providing technical briefings to some members of the Assembly but not all members of the Assembly being invited to that technical briefing, if in fact a breach of privilege has happened to other members, if not just the opposition, for the provision of a technical briefing that some members may not have been able to attend or be invited to. I will make additional considerations around that particular issue. I think that much has been said about this issue of technical briefings, and I think it is important that the Speaker takes time to consider both the submissions today as well as the precedent, and I will be reporting back to the House on Monday with the final decision on this point of privilege. Honourable members, we are at orders of the day, orders du jour.
Bills and orders for second reading. Bill 7, Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020. Adjourned debate. Honourable Mr. Schweitzer.
Honourable members, is there anyone wishing to speak to second reading of Bill 7? The Honourable Member for Edmonton McClung has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleasure this afternoon to rise and speak on this important bill, which touches upon the lifeblood of this province. And going forward, of course, we will always be intent on making sure that the proper amount of scrutiny is placed upon any proposal to build new energy developments. We do, of course, always look for efficiency and shorter timelines for decision by the AER. However, of course, there's concerns when we have an arbitrary measure such as this bill imposed upon the AER in terms of the timelines for their deliberations. While it would be granting greater certainty for everyone involved to have timelines shortened and to ensure that industry proponents know exactly when the deadlines will be in place for deliberations on on proposals that might come forward to build new infrastructure. The consultations and the assessments have to be done correctly, and government needs to support that. I think we've seen instances, numerous instances over the last recent history in this country where indeed it was determined by the courts, of course, with Kinder Morgan, now what is now called the Trans Mountain Pipeline, ended up having to reconsider and go back into deliberations because the courts determined that the deliberations were inadequate. And that is a situation that we dearly want to avoid going forward, and I think that this bill perhaps risks that we end up in court more regularly because those who may be objectors to a certain proposal or energy infrastructure proposal may feel they were subjected to too short a time frame. We didn't have the opportunity to properly bring forward their concerns, and indeed the courts have set precedents showing that that was the case. If the procedures in place to consider the proposals that are brought forward to build infrastructure were deemed to be circumventing the ability of those who might oppose projects, then the courts will decide and side in favor of those proponents who felt that they were subjected to shortened arbitrary time frames. So it's very, very important that we do have proper consultation and assessments that are done correctly. We have a reputation in this country of ensuring that our environment is protected, and I think that's something that we in Alberta should move towards making sure is established as part of any type of legislation that we bring forward to change how the process of approval for energy infrastructure is made in this country. As I said, arbitrary nature of these timelines that Cabinet seems to be investing in itself with this legislation, I believe can set ourselves up for legal disputes. And that is really contrary to what the legislation hopes to do. It hopes, I believe, to make approvals more efficient, to give certainty and to make sure that unnecessary costs are not added to the process. As I mentioned, we've had challenges to process before and potentially failures, as we've seen with Northern Gateway or Trans Mountain, and it's very concerning that this bill will end up exposing ourselves to similar types of challenges in the future because of the fact that it does grant the cabinet in and of itself, the ability to set an arbitrary timeline, which may not actually give adequate time for a full consideration and a full hearing for those who wish to speak and bring concerns forward, or for that matter, even those who are the proponents of the infrastructure that is being proposed, to fully make sure that their concerns and their desires to have the project go forward are brought to the public forum. And that's indeed not only for Canadian consumption, Mr. Speaker, but for international, industrial, commercial consumption. I think it's important that we lay bare the debates over any type of infrastructure proposal that the AER would consider, so that it remains unchallenged by the courts, so that decisions have the respect of those who participate in the process, as well as the public, who anytime a government basically says, look, we're creating a time limit here, there's an inherent injustice that may be claimed by one side or the other. And I'm very concerned about that, perhaps making the whole process more problematic and creating problems for the AER that the government is actually trying to intend to solve with this very legislation. So I know that during our time in government, we did improve the process significantly by streamlining and digitizing it, and there was quite a bit of cost saving involved in that as well. I don't know if the minister can lay out what the plans are for the timelines that they intend to impose upon AER. This bill certainly does not. There's a number of questions we have about how it will work with projects that have shared jurisdictions. Interprovincial projects are, of course, very complex. We may have, of course, more than one level of government involved. How, indeed, do you come to the decision to determine what timelines are appropriate? It's not necessarily something that is an applied science at the moment. I can sense that Cabinet will have a guessing game on its hands when it comes to many of these projects that the AER has before it, and there's new developments all along the way. And of course, as we know, during this time of pandemic globally, there are surprises that the governments will come upon, and it will affect their timelines on a variety of things. And of course, major developments in pipeline or other energy infrastructure projects can get set back by any number of things. And an arbitrary ministerial or cabinet decision to limit an AER consideration time frame may indeed be a hampering mechanism rather than one that empowers the AER to make more streamlined and more efficient decisions. So there's a risk inherent in what the bill proposes. Certainly, I don't know if the risks are being considered fully and contemplated fully by the bill, and those are questions I think the government should be answering in attempting to assuage the concerns of those who fear that this bill may actually create more problems than it purports to solve. I'm not sure if indeed the commercial benefit from this is going to be something that is seen as much as the government hopes. I'm just thinking of the corporate boardrooms who are looking at this type of an arbitrary cabinet decision, and the know from past experience that globally, investors are very sensitive to environmental considerations, to considerations regarding climate change and carbon footprints and so forth. And we've seen de-investment from our own oil sands, from major investment holders who've decided that there are certain decisions that were made in this province that were not favorable to their investors, and they've decided not to invest. This move, I don't think is one, by this move I mean this Bill 7, is one that perhaps will add to their fear about the level of consideration that is being given to the environment and to climate change by major investors around the world who see the sources of oil production certainly throughout many parts of the world, many of which will supply the world at a cheaper cost, and they rank them against our potential developments and those that the AER may be considering, and they take a look at this bill and they say, well, goodness, this government has given itself the opportunity to put a limit, put a clamp on what consideration is taken for major oil projects and infrastructure projects in the energy field, and therefore it may even further dampen their willingness to want to invest in our energy projects and in developing our oil sands and Western Canadian energy developments and pipelines and other infrastructure that AER might consider. So I think that it's really incumbent upon the government to make sure that they are very, very clear about how they've thought through in terms of what the risk will be to the investment in our oil sands and other energy developments in this province. I know that this bill is intended to add clarity to the whole process, to give some comfort to commercial interests when they are making investments in projects and infrastructure for energy development in the province, but it may have the opposite consequence. So I think that I'd like to hear from the government members about that, whether they've actually thought that through, and if they've discounted that as an argument, why so? It seems to me it's very, very timely to consider what the international financiers are looking at in terms of oil investments, when we know that given just before the pandemic, there was a major decision by Saudi Arabia to limit its oil production, and of course that went along with the Russian curtailment, and we ended up having a huge price drop in the price of oil just before a major pandemic hit, and we know what the consequences have been for Alberta. So anything that will perhaps put a damper on investment decisions to consider Alberta oil, which is more expensive to produce than many other portions of the global oil production, is something that one must consider very, very strongly. And I think that that's something that the bill hasn't really contemplated, and I think we have to look at it in the lens of our current situation in the province, where the world, the global investment world, and the energy world is looking at who can produce this barrel of oil, not only the cheapest, but also with the lowest carbon footprint, because that is something that, for the long term, global financiers are taking into consideration very, very strongly. So on top of that, there, of course, there's a red tape issue that the government is trying to avoid at every step, but here they are sort of sticking a spoke in the wheels of the process for approving oil and energy projects by giving cabinet authority to limit the time frame of consideration by the AER. And I think that on top of the red tape that produces, it also sets out some red flags to the international investment community. And rather than actually creating certainty, I think it creates it's the opposite. It creates uncertainty, because there you have this arbitrary nature of the cabinet's ability to go in and limit the time frame. It's like a government placing time frame or time limits on debate, on closure. It makes it inherently unjust, perhaps. And I'm concerned that in future we'll see major investors not have certainty, because they don't know at what point the government may actually shut things down, whereas previously, yeah, there may have been some delay because the courts would be involved, but at least there was a certainty of a court decision to rely upon once that point was reached. Here, there's a guessing game going on as to whether the government of the day might in fact decide upon approval of a project or not, and based on that, they set the time frame accordingly so that the playing field may be balanced one way or another. And I've got a lot of concerns about the legislation, and I know that other members of my caucus have expressed concerns as well, and that they may wish to speak more length on some of the other measures, particularly the red tape issue, and some of the details about whether or not the direction that Cabinet gives to the AER, because they set a certain limitation or time frame on the deliberations on a certain project approval, whether or not they are actually sort of an unseen hand that will sway the AER, not only in its deliberations of that particular project, but also for future and ongoing projects. We've seen the same thing with the other pieces of legislation the government has brought forward, where they want to, in fact, during a time of emergency, go ahead and interfere with a municipality's decision-making process. And we see the same pattern here in this piece of legislation, where the government's hand is influencing how the process operates in terms of approving an infrastructure project, and kind of tilting the playing field in one way or the other, as depending upon the government of the day and their decision to support or not a particular project that AER has under consideration. So with that, I think I'll leave those questions for the government to perhaps respond to, and I hope to hear some responses and some considered and thoughtful arguments, perhaps back and forth during the debate on this piece of legislation. But I'll also leave some time for members of my own caucus as well to add to some of the comments that I've made and outline some of their concerns or supports for other pieces of this bill. So I thank members of the Assembly for their attention, and will cede my time to other members who wish to bring forward their thoughts on this bill.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie is looking to join debate.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure, as always, to get up and speak to the bill. I just want to be absolutely 100% clear that we are in favor of supporting shorter timelines for decisions by the AER. But of course, one of the things that I want to touch on specifically when it comes to Bill 7, Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020, is the whole issue of consultations and assessments, but specifically in regards to Indigenous communities. And because I've had a fair amount of experience visiting Indigenous communities all across Alberta, and I know enough to know that, speaking to the chief and council of an Indigenous community, a nation, is not simply the only way that you can consult. In fact, it is the opinion of several members of Indigenous communities that it's the responsibility of a chief and council to take the information back to its members, back to the members of the community, and to hold discussions on what's being proposed. Now, I want to, and it's important because we're putting in this context because, of course, we're trying to shorten the timelines, while at the same time, if we are to truly respect how Indigenous communities discern whether they want to move forward with a particular project or how they are going to be participating within a particular project, that needs to take its time as well. And I'll remind members of this House that the whole concept of chief and council was actually something established by the Indian Act, Canadian law. And it's not so much the way that the majority of Indigenous communities actually conceptualize of leadership and authority within their communities. For those who know the topic well, they will know that elders in the community play an essential role in the decision-making process. And in light of the fact that as a society we have matured enough to now know that we need to do our best for reconciliation here in the province of Alberta as a government, to reconcile with Indigenous communities because of injustices that have occurred in the past. I think that this needs to be highly considered, right? It's also an important part of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, not only the reconciliation process that we need to do as well. We need to understand that there are international laws decided upon, discerned on by Indigenous communities worldwide. And I know that perhaps not all agree with what has been stated inside of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, but that we should be doing our best as a government to make sure that we are respecting Indigenous communities fully. And again, I go back to the role of Indigenous elders within those communities. And knowing that simply reaching out to the chief of a particular nation and having a discussion, although it is legitimate, is not the only way that consultation can take place. And if we are to be fair and just in our processes, then we should strive to encourage and provide the time for Indigenous communities to actually go through a consultation process with people in their communities, right? So I know it's kind of like a catch-22. We're saying let's shorten the timelines, but we're also saying let's make sure to respect the time that is required for communities to actually have a voice at the table and not conceptualize chief and council and Indigenous communities as all being just one homogeneous group of people. Just like we have in our society, we have people of different ideologies, different philosophies, different ways of looking, different, I just clarify and say different perspectives. You're going to get that same cross-section within Indigenous communities as well. Not all agree on, for example, what some may call development. And it's really important that we respect all the particular perspectives within Indigenous communities so that when we're moving forward as a society together, hand in hand, trying to make Alberta a better place, we're doing it where we're trying to respect the most amount of people as we possibly can within a process. And at least giving the opportunity for people to provide insight and feedback. And of course, I mean, it's a well-known perspective now that's been shared with Canadian society, or I would say is, North American society in general, that Indigenous peoples, especially traditional perspectives, choose to contemplate how a particular decision is going to affect even 7 generations down the line. And I think that this is food for thought for us as people who govern or participate in the governing process, that we should also contemplate how is this going to affect people 7 generations down the line, and that it's important for us to not only provide the time for Indigenous communities to do that themselves, but then also us to be able to contemplate that and take into consideration. So that being said, I just want to say that, for example, when we were in government, and it's something that was really near and dear to my heart, is making sure that we were putting in place the calls for action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the time. As people well know, prior to 2015, there were a number of hearings held throughout the entire country regarding truth and reconciliation with Indigenous communities. Members from communities had an opportunity to come into these large general assemblies and actually share their personal and historical perspectives among these large groups of people from Indigenous and non-Indigenous backgrounds. And it was such an incredible learning opportunity for the people that participated in this process. And I think that it's important for us to do justice to not only the people who participated and dedicated their time and energy and immense efforts to going through these processes of discernment and coming up with these calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but to make sure that within our own processes and how we relate and interrelate with Indigenous communities here better stated, Indigenous nations here in the province of Alberta, that we pay respect to that process and that we make sure that we're incorporating as much as we possibly can avenues by which this can take place. And of course, it was so near and dear to my heart, and many in the Alberta NDP caucus, that while we were in government, we invested a serious amount of time and energy into making sure that Indigenous consultation was being done. And not only that, we were just saying, okay, let's do it. No, it was actually providing the space to have these conversations about how we can potentially do it. What does it look like? So that it's not a top-down approach of saying, okay, well, we're gonna consult. We're gonna provide the opportunity, and this is how it's gonna be done. No, actually working with Indigenous communities. And I want to say that, the member from Edmonton, Rutherford, did an exceptional role, did an exceptional work in connecting with so many Indigenous nations across Alberta, in all treaty areas of 6, 7, and 8, visiting these communities, going and spending time not only with chief and council again, but with elders from these communities. I can tell you that, and I'm sure that many people within this House actually feel this way and think about it this way, but we respect our elders. We respect the people in our communities that came before us, and we honor the experiences that they have had. And when they speak, we listen so that we may gain insight upon how they lived their lives and how they made decisions. And of course, again, you're going to get a wide spectrum of different beliefs and ways of looking at life and the world. But it's important that we provide that opportunity. And I just want to speak to the fact that the member from Edmonton Rutherford, while he was the Minister of Indigenous Relations, did a phenomenal job of making sure to connect with Indigenous communities and then discuss and come up with, in concert with them, what consultation capacity to ensure that Indigenous people could participate in the very best way possible within on how we were interacting, and I would say that in that nation-to-nation relationship. So it's really important that this not be swept aside, swept under the rug, that we continue to look at ways that this can be done in the most effective manner. I understand that shorter timelines are important in order to make so that we can have projects move forward in a more timely manner. But again, what we're seeing here is that we're setting arbitrary timelines. And it seems to me that that this is the government, kind of setting itself up for legal challenges and potentially failures, as we have seen with the Northern Gateway or Trans Mountain. So it's important that we take all this into consideration. Now, one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that when we were in government very early on, and thanks to us having an incredible, insightful leader and others that were leading in our government, we were able to get a number of different stakeholders from different perspectives, right? Getting Indigenous communities sitting at the table with people who are advocates of the environment, getting oil, the petroleum industry sitting at the table, all people sitting together at the table so that we could then come up with the way that we move forward. And it wasn't about pitting one group against another. No, it was a way of getting everybody to sit at the table and to discuss how we could potentially move projects forward in a respectful manner, making sure that everybody had input within the process. So at least us who are on the governing side could then take those perspectives, those insights into consideration when coming up with changes in the law and regulation as they applied, and particularly in this instance to the AER. Now, all this is being done in the context of the fact that the government now has recently rolled back or suspended a number of environmental protections. And this has been done largely without consulting Indigenous people. So here I am raising the red flag on this call and saying, our country went through a process of making sure that
Thank you, Honourable Members. 29-2A is available, and I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton-McClung has risen on that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under 29-2A, I'd certainly like to hear some more from the Honourable Member just spoken, and I certainly know that we are in a very, very unique time in history, global history, but also our history in this province, where in the middle of a pandemic, but also in the middle of a crisis in our energy industry. And of course, the government with this bill is very, very significantly altering the process by which Alberta Energy Regulator might operate, and will subject them to arbitrary cabinet time frames based upon picking winners and losers potentially, and setting the time frame to perhaps reach an outcome desired by the government of the day. And I know that there are going to be significant deliberations Mr. Speaker, around new concepts in energy and implementation of things such as solar, wind, nuclear power, small nuclear power. Is going to be looking at new electricity, hydro dams, electricity generation from hydro dams using what's called water batteries, all kinds of energy infrastructure. It's certainly a significant part of Alberta's economy and will be so for the foreseeable future, but it has to be dealt with correctly in the environment of super scrutiny that all oil-producing regions are under, because as is well known, there are options for people from countries who wish to buy energy and natural gas. The time is long since passed when, for example, in my grandmother's era, where she would ride her one-eyed pony out and watch the construction of an oil field derrick outside of her Thorhild home, and know that in short order there would be oil coming out of the ground, and now things are changed a lot. The process is much more under scrutiny, and rightly so. So in order not to jeopardize the industry we rely upon so much, I think that even past generations would agree, including my grandmother, that the scrutiny is warranted. And we don't want to end up being subjected to situations, Mr. Speaker, where we end up with an abandoned well situation or similar to what we have now, because regulations perhaps were not considered well enough by the energy regulator of the time in approving projects or oil field development. So I know that the member who recently spoke from our caucus talked about the importance of the new types of energy that are coming on and the importance of consultation. And I know that there are many pieces of oil infrastructure running through his riding of Edmonton-Ellerslie, I think I have it correct. And I'm just wondering about the amount of talk that he's heard in his riding about different energy projects, different new types of energy production that we have on the table, and new projects that will be considered by the Alberta Energy Regulator. I know that things that are in vogue right now, of course, this particular government is talking about selling off parks and opening up coal mines. And that debate, of course, on the eastern slopes of our Rockies is something that I was involved in since grade 11, debating days. I know on a Sunday afternoon, CFRN Radio here in Edmonton hosted a radio debate between members of high school debating teams and prominent members of government and business. And one particular Sunday afternoon, it would have been 1973, myself and my debating partner, after doing about 3 months of research, were involved in a radio debate about the development of the eastern slopes of the Rockies versus coal mine development, land reclamation, recreational development, pristine watershed development, all that kind of thing came into the context of the debate. And our debating opponent was the then Environment Minister, Mr. Bill Yurko. And Mr. Yurko wasn't too pleased with us because we'd had 3 months benefit of research going into that debate. And I know that Mr. Bruce Hogle, retired now from CFRN, enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We may have to wait for committee to hear a response. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview has risen to join debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I'd like to add a few comments to the comments of my colleagues just presented on Bill 7, the Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020. And certainly what we're understanding from the UCP government is this bill will hold the AER accountable for timely application reviews. And this will be a step towards making the province regulatory system more effective and efficient. Actually, even the best in North America is what the UCP is saying. They're doing this partially, I think, because they heard in consultation that they are reporting to have had with industry that it will enhance the process and improve things. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want to indicate that I, too, would like the process to be more efficient and that timelines to be shorter. But I guess the big question is at what cost? And so we need to look at, is this being expedited or the timeline shortened? In doing that, is that compromising the actual thoroughness and effectiveness of the process? So certainly we need to look at that and make sure that a due process, due diligence is carried out. And our own energy critic here on the NDP side has certainly spoken about that. And we do support clear and consistent timelines for decisions by the Alberta Energy Regulator. They're needed to provide greater certainty for everyone involved. This is really something that we can totally agree on, that this is something that's important and that we do want to create consistent, clear guidelines. So while, he said that while in government we improved the process ourselves significantly by streamlining and digitizing it and by investing in Indigenous consultation capacity to ensure that Indigenous people were included in resource development decisions. We know that if the UCP wants to improve the approval timelines, consultations and assessments have to be done right. They have to be done right. It's so crucial to this very important work of the AER. They must have meaningful support for consultation capacity in place to avoid court challenges, prevent delays in getting our resources to market, and of course securing jobs for Albertans. So certainly we're on this side of the House, we are in support of making the timelines shorter, but they need to be comprehensive enough to make sure that they're done properly and that consultation is done with groups involved, and so that considerations are made that are important to be made. Forgive me if I'm somewhat cynical, but I feel that even this week we heard from the Minister of Energy say very clearly, and it made international, national news, certainly local news. I think it was The Guardian in the UK who published it, but the Minister of Energy said, well, this is a great time to build pipelines because it's under the cover of COVID-19, and so not as many people can get together to protest. So having heard the comments of the minister in the media, this does cause me to question the sincerity of the government. It doesn't seem like they do necessarily care. It doesn't seem that they are concerned about doing it correctly and comprehensively and including all voices, not just select voices that they want to hear from. And of course, this is all very fundamental to democracy. It's not about just elevating the voices of people you want to hear from. It's from actually everyone is a citizen of our province. Everyone has the right to speak up. And it's not just a select few. And that's something that, that's certainly one of the things that motivates me in my work, is that I'm standing up for all my constituents and listening to all their voices. And certainly in government, we did that. And I certainly would like to know that this government is doing that, and that is one of the fundamental tenets of any democracy, that people's voices are heard and they're not dismissed. And certainly the right to assembly, the right to speak, is something that needs to be honored. It's a right of a Canadian citizen. So it's very disheartening to hear the Minister of Energy, off the cuff, just say how much she disregards it because she has her focus and her view. And, it's highly disrespectful to many people who are very concerned about the environment sacred lands of the Indigenous people. So I want to bring that to this government's attention, that it's so important that these shortened timelines that they're proposing in this bill aren't going to just, run over or dismiss or slam through without proper process and the care for people's perspectives. I hope it's a sincere process. It has integrity. These are sort of principles, tenets of any kind of a healthy process. But having heard these comments, on national news, in various international publications, I question that. I think it's very clear that the minister doesn't necessarily have the time of day for perhaps people who think differently than her. And that's really disturbing. And certainly we have seen that this government has done that in other ways also. With Indigenous people specifically, I'll just share a few examples. Before they took office, they were criticized for planning to sell treaty land without consultation. So this was, something that they spoke about on the campaign trail. And of course, the relationship between Indigenous people and a government is nation to nation. And so to act like an owner of something that's not yours, which is what was being done by the UCP, that is not a respectful relationship. And just in recent weeks, Indigenous people criticized the government for failing to consult them on changes to the environmental monitoring and the province's long-standing coal policy. So again, these are just more examples of why we on this side of the House are really concerned that this shortened timeline is going to mean that some people's opportunity to be involved in a robust consultation or understanding of some of the challenges that these decisions could have on the environment, on Indigenous people's land, are going to be disregarded. And it might actually, in the long run, create more difficulty for projects being approved, because as we all know, with Trans Mountain, the federal government had to go back, didn't they? They had to go back again and again because the Supreme Court of Canada, the National Energy Board told them, hey, you did not do your due diligence. You did not have a robust, integrous process regarding the Trans Mountain. You need to go back and you consult in an authentic, sincere, honest way with Indigenous people. And so that's what they did. They did go back. But guess what? That took way longer. That took way longer. So I just want to say to this government, we have to make sure that these shortened timelines don't negate important voices in our communities. We must make sure that our process is sincere, because in the long run, it will come back. And, we don't want to repeat those mistakes. We need to learn from past mistakes that have really hurt our province significantly. Our oil and gas industry is very important to us. Not having another pipeline, not having the Trans Mountain, for example, to Tidewater, meant we were very vulnerable to the U.S. And so having that was something, our leader, our government fought for to have that there. But because of another order of government's neglect, really, to do things in proper process, and then finally the National Energy Board's demand that they go back and do appropriate, not only consultation with the Indigenous people, but also regarding the marine area on the BC coast. because the impact in the environment on whales was one of the aspects of it, to make sure that marine life wouldn't be negatively impacted by that. So I guess I'm just cautioning the government to be sure that these shortened timelines are still fair and will create enough of a comprehensive opportunity for assessment in the application process, because we don't want to have to take twice as long, and we don't have to want to go through sort of expensive court challenges that will cost us more. I mean, another thing that I guess I'd like to bring up is I know that this government has created a ministry of cutting red tape, and you know, the intent is very much to streamline, I think, government processes, and again, that's something that we can all appreciate. I mean, we know governments can be very cumbersome, and you have to fill out this form or talk to this person or this, and it can be you know, difficult. And so, you know, the intent of that is a good idea. The trouble is when you're doing that, are you cutting off a process that's actually key to making sure that proper consultations or assessments are done? And it's not, so maybe, you know, like making sure that employers follow through on implementing the employment standards, or make sure they're respecting the labor code. So having the due diligence to be able to check on that stuff means that that's not red tape, that's important oversight. And of course, that's one of the big jobs of government, is oversight, is that we're looking to make sure that things are done fair, and that you know, the best interests of the citizens are taken care of. And so we want to make sure that it's not just about, you know, cutting it so much that actually very vital parts of the work is done. And so cutting red tape, while it may seem like a positive thing to do, it can also take away processes that can really hurt our society, hurt our environment, for example, and hurt Indigenous people. So especially in this area, that's just my caution to the government, that they make sure that what they're doing is not going to compromise consultation with Indigenous people, with environmental groups. And so, you know, I've obviously said this loud and clear. You know, previously, when our government was in power, I was the Minister of Seniors and Housing, and in that time we created an affordable housing strategy for Indigenous people. And I was a bit frustrated by that process because it took so long. It took longer than you know, this was a distinct strategy specifically for Indigenous people. It took longer than it did the sort of more overarching strategy. And I was kind of frustrated with my staff a bit about that, but I certainly learned a lot in that process, and I learned how important it was to take the time to get it right. And I certainly was thanked by Indigenous people for really listening to what their perspective was, and coming at the whole program, the whole funding model, how it was set up from their perspective. And that took it took more time, and it took us sort of stepping back and letting them lead that process more. And so I think that it's so important for us to make sure that we are you know, working, collaborating with Indigenous people from a nation-to-nation perspective. And certainly that was what I and my ministry worked very hard on to make sure would happen.
Thank you, Honourable Members. 29-2A is available, and the Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie has caught my eye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very eager to know the perspective of the member from Edmonton Riverview, because I know that she's out in her community substantially, that these issues regarding The AER and specifically Indigenous consultation are important to constituents of hers, and I want to ask her, when she's out, prior to the pandemic, of course, when she was out on the doorsteps, what kinds of things did she hear about Indigenous consultation from her constituents?
Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member from Ellerslie for the question. And, you know, I'm so fortunate in Edmonton Riverview. It's really it's kind of a central Edmonton riding, and it has, it's mostly sort of mature residential neighborhoods, very little, I mean, there's the university and the university hospital, so there's those big institutions. But most of it's residential, mature neighborhoods, very beautiful. And I'm always sort of awed at just a lot of the brilliance of the constituents. I learn so much when I go to the doorsteps and hear of their passions. Many of them are oftentimes professors, students, because of course the close proximity to the university, nurses, doctors who work at the university hospital sort of for the same reason. And I learned so many different perspectives from them and just amazing expertise. And I'm so grateful for that. And I know that there's a deep compassion, certainly amongst my constituents, for really caring about one another and really creating communities. There's over, I think there's 16 community leagues, which is kind of a unique situation in Edmonton. I think Calgary has a different system, but these are sort of hubs of people getting together in their own communities. And so they have activities of all kinds, from, you know, activities for young children to seniors and everyone in between. And another thing about my riding is so cool is because there's so much park land, because of course it's called Riverview, and it's on both sides of the North Saskatchewan River. So it's magnificent. Just too many, trails you can walk on, and certainly if you're canoeing down the river or in a boat, you can just really enjoy how beautiful Riverview is. But I mean, one of the things that is so important is that people understand what we, as sort of the dominant culture, have done to the Indigenous people in our province, and are educated largely in that, and understand this notion of nation to nation, and how important it is for us to be sure that we are not, once again, like our people before us, sort of running roughshod over other people and not respecting their rights. And so I know that this is very important to my constituents, making sure that people are cared for, and I know that there's so many who care deeply for the environment and making sure that we are respecting the environment. They certainly understand the importance of the oil and gas industry in our province, but we're in 2020, we're able to do both. We can be responsible stewards of the environment, and we can have a robust oil and gas industry. Those two can go together. And certainly we did create that when we were government. We had a climate leadership plan, and we were giving tremendous support to the oil and gas industry. So those things together are really important, and it's not one or the other. And if we say that it is one or the other, we're mistaken. We need, of course, the environmental groups need to work alongside with the oil industry, as the oil industry needs to work alongside the environmental groups. It's not just me saying this. You hear this from oil companies repeatedly, how important it is for them to be responsible stewards of the environment. So these are some of the things that I hear from my constituents, and I'm always very grateful to have those opportunities to connect with them. I know it's been harder lately because of COVID-19 and just not being able to have that kind of contact. But certainly lots of virtual meetings and emails and phone calls also have helped me keep in touch with them.
Thank you, honourable members. Are there any members wishing to join debate? I see the honourable member for Edmonton Meadows has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise and add my comments to the Bill 7, that it reads Responsible Energy Development Amendments Act 2020. So I'm really happy to see that the bold statement, the goal it's trying to achieve, and we support the content where it says it's trying to, this bill will help to provide the efficiency to decision making by shortening the timelines of due process. What comes to my mind, going through some of the information I was able to glance through on this bill, is when we are saying that we want it to be shorter timeline, consistent approach to coming to the decision makings and approval process with regards to the energy projects. So a question to my mind, going through the information, is what mechanism we are considering and what tools we are providing, what kind of resources we are considering that the government right now would see these are challenges and obstacles, or they would consider so-called red tape in their terminology, and but they're trying to address through this bill. So this was not really very clear to me how they're going to achieve this goal and what is different that we are going to do this time. So going forward, we will not face the same challenges that we have in the past. So lessons could be, basically I would say the lessons have been learned from the Trans-Mountain and Northern Gateway with a lengthy process of the reason that there's a number of stakeholders. It's not really upon like how do you convince all those stakeholders, but I think the contingent upon was how we have provided the resources and the spaces for all the diverse voices. They were the key to the decision making, and in this case, the courts from every level of in this whole process, took this very seriously, basically when it comes to consultation and assessments, the proper resources and the accurate approaches were not considered or provided, and that has costed Alberta energy industry and not industry Albertans, I would say, the big time. So the damages was done. Similarly, I would see the government just says that made a bold statement they would like to have the timeline and a consistent approval process in this case, but how would they come to achieve this goal is a big question. I don't really see, I'm still going back and forth. So what resources, what they're trying to do different that we were not doing in the past, I'm really actually not able to make any obvious point that would help government achieve the goals they are claiming they will do this through this bill. So, as speaking on behalf of my constituents, I once again wanted to say the the number of people, number of my constituents are affected due to, the low global oil prices and going this, the pipeline, disputes. The project have been waiting to get through for years and years. But that has been very hot topics in my constituency, I would say. The people wanted to know, and when it comes to discussion, the one thing is obvious, like we had number of stereotypings in the past. We kept blaming our neighbor jurisdictions. They were, the projects were being halted because of one or the other jurisdictions, because of their different political views, but that was not the case. The Honourable, the courts were very clear on this. Not only the key stakeholders to this, the indigenous communities, I would say out loud, but not convinced on this specific projects to come and come on this side and agree to all the decision makings that was in hand by the Canada Energy Board, I would say, or the government decisions, or all the other the partners of this decision makings. The biggest challenge to this project was the indigenous communities specifically was not provided the proper space they deserved to be listened. So it took another years for the federal government to, that was wasted. There are still a number of stakeholders, they probably do not agree to what the government is proposing or government has been deciding on this, but at least the due diligence has been done. The due diligence is, I think, the utmost important, as my colleague from the Edmonton Riverview reiterated this, that is the fundamental tenet of the democracy, and that's why I think we all in this House today, having the privilege to discuss this bid on behalf of our constituents, and I think we hold the accountability to Albertans. So we will discuss this bid due diligently and discuss all the aspects pertaining to such subjects and come into the common ground and decision where we will see not all parties probably agree to what are being decided, but their voices are listened. So it's not, they were not provided the opportunity to be part of it. So that is something not clearly outlined so far yet, but I'm looking into the Bill 7, how this government is trying to achieve this by simply providing the greater amount of power to the government or to the ministry or to such an agencies is not basically going to address this the simple issue, I would say. The simple, I'm going to see this as an issue that has a greater effects on all Albertans. Doesn't matter which political stripes you belong to. So when this comes to not only the key stakeholders, I think regardless of your political stripes, all the political views should have been, reflected in this decision making. There should be a mechanism where all different political views could come come together where we could say, the voices from all Albertans have been heard. It's not only projects that's important for the energy industry. The millions of Albertans' future is actually relying on these decisions. And to speed up, as this is what the government is saying, the mandate of this, the Bill 7 is, if this is this, so those mechanism, I think, has applied without taking these steps into consideration. I don't think we can achieve this goal. And the other thing, I would say, I just wanted to put it, I'm just looking for the word. It needs to reflect the government's approach and honesty when we are discussing this issue, what message we wanted to send to the different political views or the key stakeholders or the communities within Alberta, communities in Canada, or communities around the world, because this is very important. It's not only to build these projects to help get our sources out, but we also need, this will only be worth doing if we are able to find the diverse market for our sources. One of the biggest, the point I wanted to raise that's incredibly important, I think, and is linked to this issue, is that when government has suspended the environmental monitoring on our parks. So if I would take this into perspective, when we see the world's largest fund has divested the four major Alberta energy corporations, this is very important. What kind of messages we wanted to send to the global community, because it will be only beneficial if we have ability to get resources from under the ground, and then we have a market for it properly to get the proper the value of our resources. This is the only way we will be able to not only help the energy industry, but also the Albertan can benefit from these resources. So that was some of my comments I wanted to add to Bill 7, and I will conclude my comments with this statement for now, and then pass on to my colleagues next, and then if there is opportunity, I will probably speak to this Bill 7 again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable. Number 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie has risen.
Yes, the member spoke at length, but I just wanted to give him an opportunity to see if he wanted to add any additional thoughts, but specifically as they may relate to constituents that he has spoken with. I know that the member from Edmonton Meadows, like Edmonton Ellerslie, we have a wide diversity of ethnic representation within our constituencies, and I'm hoping that specifically you could speak and share perhaps from different perspectives within your constituency, the people that you meet with on a daily basis, of course, prior to the pandemic. If you could share some insights that they have shared with you, of course, through you, Mr. Speaker, to the member from Edmonton Meadows.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Meadows.
Thank you, from Edmonton Ellerslie, giving me the opportunity to share some of the experience on behalf of my constituents. As I said, I had this issue was pretty hot topic during the elections last year, and every second and third door we knocked and spoke to our constituents. This question was raised the future of our oil industry, energy industry, and every third or fourth house we will just, door knock and talk to the people. They would, directly, their employment directly relied on the energy industry, and they were so worried. And also during the pandemic, I've been speaking to so many of my constituents, and as I said, my constituency is one of the most, ethnic riding, where there's so many diverse communities and people from all across the world moving to Canada, coming to Alberta, making that riding a home. And a number of my constituents are entrepreneurs, running their own businesses and part of small-scale industry, and proudly actually, providing and contributing to these small businesses. But due to the COVID-19, the situation, their businesses are devastating, and once they are looking for help, right now they're begging for help to get back to the businesses, get their businesses back to work. And also, this issue always comes up very closely because the energy industry is the biggest contributor to our economy in Alberta. So some of those conversations I would really like to bring into to the House, as how the small business industry has been devastated due to the COVID-19. One of my constituents just gave me a call, who owns a small business, part of actually as location is part of a big the mall here in Edmonton. The business is still open, and his business is part of relaunch strategy phase 1. He said his rent alone, without paying his utility bills and salaries and withdrawing his own salaries, his rent for the space, the lease payment alone, is a $6,000, but he hardly recovered, like opening his business for like 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. at night, spending long hours. And this month, his business made a gross income of $5,800. So that could not be, he's not able to pay rent. The inventory cost is not part of it. His salary, wages is on top of it. And thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Mill Woods has risen to speak on this bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise in second reading on Bill 7, Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act 2020. And at second reading, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of my initial impressions from reviewing the bill and posing questions that I hope through further bill debate that we will have the opportunity to engage in here in this chamber. I have to start by saying that I strongly support responsible energy development and appreciate that this bill is bringing forward the goal of continuing to support energy development and the processes of the AER. That being said, I have some questions and concerns around the bill and what it is doing. Specifically, because differences in regulatory approvals and timelines between jurisdictions is an issue that has been raised for some time. It's one that our government, while we were in government, worked hard to try to address. It's one that industry associations like CAP have looked at and written reports on. But in the reading that I've done and looking into this bill, the setting of arbitrary timelines does not seem to be how other jurisdictions are successful. Other jurisdictions have improved timelines, and because they have improved processes. Not because of an arbitrary deadline being set, but because of an integrated process. In looking at Saskatchewan's system put in 2011, being able to streamline that process and to improve it seems to be how other jurisdictions have dealt with delays. And in fact, in our own area, here in Alberta, when we've looked at issues within the AER, there appears to be more delays with logistics, not enough using of online processes, which is something that is improving, clear policy direction being missing, so communication delays between government and the AER, holding up specific projects for significant amounts of time. So that obviously requires conversations between the government and the AER in order to resolve. The government having a hammer of a deadline that they can impose raises a number of concerns that some of my colleagues have already talked about. But if we have processes that need to be followed, if there are consultation requirements that haven't been properly met, imposing a deadline by Cabinet through their regulation-making powers doesn't address those concerns. And in fact, in my reading of the bill, I'd be happy to hear more about this through the debate, it appears that the deadline set trump or supersede all other considerations. And so my concern is if there are considerations that consultation haven't been completed correctly, then we may run into issues with those approvals and uncertainty.
To interrupt the honourable member. However, taking into account the time and understanding Order 4.2, the Assembly is now adjourned until the next sitting day, which is Monday, this coming Monday afternoon at 1:30. So drive safe, stay safe this weekend, and we will reconvene on Monday.